Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The notification popped up on my phone during my lunch break at the marketing firm, where I'd been working since college graduation. My roommate from those days, Natalie, had posted another photo from her solo hiking trip in the Sierra Nevada, something she'd been planning since her messy divorce finalized in February. The picture showed her grinning at a mountain vista, backpack straps digging into her shoulders, her red bandana soaked with sweat. I double-tapped it without really looking, the way you do when you're scrolling mindlessly through a sandwich. But then my coworker Jenna leaned over my shoulder and asked who that guy was in the background, way back among the pine trees. I zoomed in and felt my appetite disappear. There was definitely someone there, just a dark shape between the trunks, maybe 60 feet behind where Natalie had set up her timer. The worst part was that Natalie had no idea anyone was there. Her caption just said something about finally finding peace after all the chaos. I immediately went back through her previous posts from the trip. She'd been documenting everything for the past 3 days, posting every few hours whenever she got signal. Sunrise shots, trail markers, her battered hiking boots next to streams. My 30th birthday was coming up next month, and Natalie had promised to be back in time for it. But now I was wondering if she'd make it back at all. The figure first appeared in a photo from yesterday morning. So far away you'd think it was just shadows playing tricks. But in each subsequent photo, that same dark shape got progressively closer. In her lunch photo from yesterday, you could make out that it was definitely a person in what looked like a brown jacket. In last night's sunset photo at her campsite, the person stood maybe 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a boulder. The most recent photo, posted just 2 hours ago, showed Natalie filtering water at a creek, and the man, because you could tell it was a man now, stood clear as day about 20 feet behind her, just watching. He wore regular street clothes, not hiking gear, and his face was turned away from the camera. But something about his posture made every hair on my neck stand up. The comments section under her posts had already started buzzing. People were asking about the photo bomber and whether she was hiking with someone, but Natalie hadn't responded to any of them, which was weird because she usually replied to everything within minutes when she had signal. I tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Then I tried messaging her through every app we had in common, Instagram, WhatsApp, even that stupid word game we'd been playing for years. Nothing. The last time she'd been online was 2 hours ago, right when she posted that water filtering photo. I started typing a comment under her post, deleted it, typed again. How do you tell someone there's a stranger stalking them without sounding completely paranoid? Finally, I just wrote, "Call me immediately when you see this," in all caps, and hit send. Jenna had gathered a small crowd around my desk by then, everyone squinting at my phone screen and arguing about whether we were overreacting. Our manager, Bradley, said it was probably just another hiker who happened to be on the same trail, that the Sierra Nevada routes were popular this time of year. But then our intern pulled up Natalie's Instagram on his laptop and projected it onto the conference room screen. When you saw all the photos laid out in a grid, the pattern was undeniable. The man appeared in 7 consecutive photos over 2 days, getting closer each time, always maintaining that same unnatural stillness while Natalie moved around doing normal hiking activities. In one photo where she was cooking dinner at her campsite, he stood just outside the circle of light from her camping stove, barely visible except for the reflection on what looked like glasses. Nobody takes the exact same route at the exact same pace for 2 days straight by coincidence. Bradley wanted us to get back to work, said we were making a mountain out of nothing, but I couldn't focus on spreadsheets while my best friend might be in danger. I pulled up the Park Service website and found the emergency contact number for the Sierra Nevada district where Natalie was hiking. The ranger who answered sounded bored until I explained the situation. Then his voice changed completely. He asked for Natalie's full name, her planned route, and the GPS coordinates from her photos. Thank God she always tagged her locations. He said they'd been getting reports about someone matching that description, a man in brown clothing who'd been spotted near several solo female hikers' campsites over the past week. 2 women had reported items missing from their tents. Nothing valuable, just personal things like hairbrushes and worn socks. The ranger took down my information and said they'd send someone to check Natalie's last known location immediately. The waiting was unbearable. I stayed at my desk long after everyone else went home, refreshing Natalie's social media every few seconds and checking my phone for any response to my messages. Around 7 that evening, her Instagram account showed she was typing. Those 3 dots appeared and my heart jumped. But then they disappeared. Appeared again. Disappeared. This went on for almost 10 minutes, like someone was starting to type and then deleting it over and over. I screenshot everything and sent it to the ranger's email, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. At 7:23, she posted a new photo, but it wasn't really a photo, just a black screen. The caption only had her location tag, some coordinates deep in the wilderness, and nothing else. The comments exploded immediately with people asking if she was okay, if her phone was broken, what was happening. Then at 7:31, a 10-second video appeared on her story. The camera was pointed at the ground, showing pine needles and dirt, and you could hear heavy breathing, not like someone exhausted from hiking, but ragged, panicked breathing. Right before the video cut off, there was a man's voice, very calm and quiet, saying something that sounded like, "Not yet." I called 911 immediately, my voice cracking as I tried to explain everything to the dispatcher. She transferred me to search and rescue, where I had to tell the whole story again while sending them all the screenshots I'd saved. The coordinator said they were mobilizing a team, but it would take at least 2 hours to reach Natalie's last coordinates. The terrain was rough and the nearest access road was miles away. 2 hours felt like a lifetime. I called Natalie's sister in Colorado, woke her up and tried to explain without completely terrifying her. She said she'd drive to the airport immediately and catch the first flight out. Then I did something stupid. I posted in a massive hiking forum asking if anyone was near those coordinates, if anyone could help. Within minutes, 3 different hikers responded saying they were within 10 miles and would head toward her location. One of them, username Colorado Trail Dog, said he'd seen a man matching the description earlier that day, walking without any gear except a small backpack, no water bottles, no hiking poles, nothing you'd need for a multi-day trek. The Instagram story disappeared after an hour, the way they do, but her account stayed active, that green dot showing she was online. Every 20 minutes or so, another black photo would appear and then get deleted within seconds. Some had partial captions like "he says" or "still here," or just random letters like she was trying to type without looking. Colorado Trail Dog kept updating the forum thread, said he'd reached the general area and was calling out for Natalie but getting no response. He found fresh boot prints, 2 sets, one definitely smaller than the other, leading off the main trail into a dense section of forest. The Park Service told him to wait for the official team, not to follow the tracks alone, but he said he could hear something that might be voices further in the woods. His last update was at 9:47. Following the sound, phone at 8% battery, will update when I can. Then nothing. The search and rescue coordinator called me directly, his professional calm barely covering real concern. They'd found Colorado Trail Dog's abandoned backpack at the tree line, his phone dead on the ground next to it. The screen cracked like it had been stepped on. By midnight, the search and rescue team had set up a base camp near Natalie's last known coordinates. The lead ranger kept me on speakerphone as they worked, probably because I'd threatened to drive up there myself if they didn't keep me informed. They'd brought thermal imaging drones and search dogs, the whole production. Around 1 a.m., one of the dogs picked up a scent and led them through thick undergrowth to a small clearing. Natalie's tent was still standing, perfectly set up like she'd just stepped out for a minute. Her sleeping bag was unrolled inside, her camp stove sitting on a flat rock with a half-eaten packet of freeze-dried mac and cheese next to it. But Natalie wasn't there. Her backpack was gone, but weirdly her hiking boots were placed neatly outside the tent, toes pointing toward the woods. The search team found her phone about 30 feet from the tent, propped against a tree stump. It was still recording video, Had been for 8 hours straight according to the file size, just filming the dark forest. The battery was almost dead, running on 2%. The ranger described everything to me as they processed the scene, and one detail made my whole body go cold. There were fingernail marks on several trees around the campsite, fresh scratches in the bark like someone had been dragged past them, trying to grab hold. The drone picked up 2 heat signatures about a quarter-mile north, moving slowly through difficult terrain. The team immediately headed that direction, but when they got close, the heat signatures separated. One stopped completely while the other moved rapidly away, too fast for someone carrying gear through the wilderness at night. They found Natalie sitting on a fallen log, barefoot, staring straight ahead. She was wearing different clothes than in her last photos, a man's oversized brown jacket over her hiking outfit. When the rangers approached, she didn't respond to her name at first, just kept mumbling numbers over and over. 873-294, 873-294. They wrapped her in emergency blankets and carried her to the helicopter that had just arrived. She was physically unharmed except for scratches on her feet and hands, but she wouldn't stop repeating those numbers or explain what had happened. I drove through the night to reach the hospital in Fresno, where they'd taken her. When I finally got to see her the next afternoon, Natalie was awake, but different. She'd answer simple questions, but would go silent whenever anyone asked about those missing hours. The police interviewed her multiple times, and she'd just stare at her bandaged hands and whisper those same numbers. A detective told me they'd run the numbers through every database they could think of. Coordinates, phone numbers, social security, license plates, but found nothing. The brown jacket she'd been wearing had no labels, no identifying marks, just smelled strongly of wood smoke and something chemical they couldn't identify. 3 days later, Colorado trail dog, real name Gary Brennan, walked out of the forest on his own, dehydrated and confused. He had no memory of anything after posting that last forum update, just woke up leaning against a tree with his shoes on the wrong feet and his backpack missing. The medical examination found a small injection mark on his neck, likely from some kind of sedative, but the toxicology results were inconclusive. They never found the man from the photos. The 8-hour video from Natalie's phone showed only darkness and trees, but the audio picked up footsteps circling the area for the first 3 hours, then nothing but forest sounds. At exactly 4:23:16 in the recording, there's a whisper that sounds like 873-294 repeated once, but the voice is too distorted to determine if it's male or female. Natalie stayed with her sister for 2 months after leaving the hospital, slowly returning to herself, though she never went hiking again and deleted all her social media accounts. She finally told me, 6 months later over coffee, that she remembered fragments. The man had never spoken to her directly, just walked behind her for 2 days, getting closer. When he finally approached her at the campsite, he'd sat across from her and pulled out a notebook filled with hundreds of photos of different women on hiking trails, all taken from behind, all at varying distances. He'd pointed to a blank page and then at her, like he was showing her where she fit in his collection. The numbers she kept repeating, she'd seen them written on the back of one photo that had fallen out. A woman who looked just like her, same red bandana, same build, standing at what appeared to be the same creek where Natalie had filtered water. The photo was dated from exactly 1 year before. October 2018 was supposed to be just another camping trip with my college buddies. I'd been managing a sporting goods store in Durango for about 2 years by then, right after my 26th birthday, while finishing up my accounting degree online. My roommate Kyle worked at the same store, and we'd been planning this hike for months with 3 other friends. Jason, who taught middle school science, his girlfriend Megan, who worked as a veterinary technician, and our buddy Christopher, who'd just gotten back from a year teaching English in Japan. We picked that specific weekend because the trails would be less crowded and the aspen trees would be turning gold throughout the San Juan Mountains. The weather forecast showed clear skies for 3 straight days, Perfect conditions for what we thought would be a straightforward camping trip through some of the most beautiful backcountry in the state. We started our hike on a Friday morning from the Cunningham Gulch trailhead, each of us carrying about 35 pounds of gear, including our winter-rated sleeping bags, since temperatures could drop below freezing at night, even in early fall. The plan was to follow the Continental Divide Trail for about 8 miles before setting up our first camp near Highland Mary Lakes. Around noon, we stopped for lunch where the trail split near a weathered wooden sign. The main path continued upward toward the lakes, but there was another trail branching off to the left, blocked by a rusted chain strung between 2 posts and a faded Forest Service sign that read, "Trail closed, hazardous conditions." Jason pulled out his GPS device and showed us that this closed trail would actually cut about 3 miles off our route, connecting back to the Continental Divide Trail further up. The path looked clear enough from where we stood, just slightly overgrown with some loose scree visible in the distance. Megan voiced what we were all thinking about taking the closed trail, saying it seemed like overkill to add 3 extra miles when the path appeared mostly intact. Christopher examined the sign more closely and noticed the date stamp was from 2015, suggesting whatever rock slide had closed it might have stabilized by now. Kyle was already unhooking the chain, arguing that the Forest Service probably just hadn't gotten around to reassessing the trail yet. The thing that convinced me was how many other boot prints we could see in the dirt beyond the chain. Clearly, we wouldn't be the first people to ignore the closure. We ducked under the barrier one by one, Jason making some joke about how his students would never let him live it down if they knew their science teacher was ignoring safety warnings. The trail started fine, maybe a bit narrower than the main path, winding through a grove of aspens whose golden leaves created a tunnel of light that made everything feel almost dreamlike. About an hour into the closed trail, the landscape began to change in subtle ways that none of us commented on at first. The aspens gave way to twisted pine trees that grew at odd angles, their trunks bent and gnarled like they'd been fighting against hurricane winds their whole lives. The bird sounds that had been constant all morning gradually faded until all we could hear was our own breathing and the crunch of gravel under our boots. Christopher kept checking his phone even though we all knew there was no signal out here, and Megan moved closer to Jason, linking her arm through his without saying why. The trail itself remained clear enough to follow, but the rock formations on either side started to feel oppressive. These massive granite walls streaked with what looked like burn marks, even though there hadn't been any forest fires in this area recently, according to the ranger station website I'd checked before we left. We found the first boot around 3 in the afternoon, just sitting there in the middle of the trail like someone had carefully placed it as a marker. It was a newer hiking boot, probably expensive based on the brand, size 11 or 12, with the laces still tied in a perfect bow. Kyle picked it up and examined it, turning it over to show us that the sole was barely worn, maybe only used for a few hikes. No foot inside, no blood, no signs of violence, just an abandoned boot that had no business being there. Jason suggested maybe someone had broken a lace and decided to leave it behind, but that didn't explain why they'd leave the entire boot, or why it looked so deliberately positioned. We spent maybe 10 minutes searching the surrounding area for its pair or any other gear, but found nothing except some weird scratches on the nearby rocks. These deep parallel grooves that ran vertically up the stone face for about 15 feet before just stopping. The second strange discovery came about 20 minutes later, when the trail opened into a small clearing where someone had set up camp recently. Very recently based on how fresh everything looked. 3 tents were still standing, but every single one had been slashed open from top to bottom, the cuts so clean and straight, they looked almost surgical. Sleeping bags were laid out inside each tent, completely zipped up and arranged as if people were still in them. But when Kyle nudged one with his trekking pole, it was obviously empty. The fire pit in the center had logs arranged for burning, but they'd never been lit, and there were 5 camp chairs set up in a perfect circle around it. What really made my chest tighten was the cooler we found tucked behind one of the tents, still full of ice, with sandwiches wrapped in plastic that couldn't have been more than a day old, based on how fresh the bread looked. Christopher started taking photos with his phone while Megan kept asking who would leave all this expensive gear behind. Easily $2,000 worth of equipment just abandoned. Jason found the journal tucked into one of the tent pockets, a small waterproof notebook with entries dating back 3 days. The handwriting started neat and organized, detailing a group's plan to explore some caves they'd heard about from locals in Silverton. But the last entry from that morning was barely legible. Just the same phrase written over and over again, covering 2 full pages. They walk between the spaces. Kyle grabbed the journal from Jason and flipped through it himself, his face going pale when he reached the final pages where someone had drawn crude figures. Dozens of stick people with too many joints in their arms and legs, all surrounding what looked like a tent. We should have left then. Should have turned around and hiked back the way we came. But Jason convinced us we were only about 2 miles from where the trail reconnected with the main path according to his GPS, and none of us wanted to admit how scared we were getting. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountain peaks when we heard the first whistle, this long, clear note that seemed to come from somewhere above us on the ridge. We all stopped walking at the same time, looking up at the rocky cliffsides trying to spot another hiker, thinking maybe the people from the abandoned camp were somewhere nearby. Then came an answering whistle from the opposite side of the canyon, identical in pitch and length, followed by a third from somewhere behind us on the trail we'd just traveled. Kyle shouted out a greeting, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, asking if anyone needed help. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath, and then all 3 whistles repeated simultaneously, except this time, they were noticeably closer. Christopher pulled out his phone to record the sound, but the battery died instantly, even though he swore it had been at 60% just minutes before. We decided to set up camp right there instead of pushing forward in the growing darkness, choosing a spot with our backs against a solid rock wall so nothing could approach from behind. Our hands fumbled with the tent poles and stakes, everyone trying to work faster as the temperature dropped and those whistles continued every few minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always from multiple directions like we were being triangulated. Jason kept insisting it had to be other hikers playing some kind of prank. Maybe the people from the abandoned camp trying to scare others away from their gear so they could come back for it later. But when Megan pointed out that no one could move that quickly between those positions on such rough terrain, he didn't have an answer. We skipped dinner entirely, just crawled into our tents as soon as they were up, though none of us actually changed out of our hiking clothes or even took off our boots. I shared a tent with Kyle, and we lay there in our sleeping bags listening to the sounds outside gradually change as full darkness set in. The whistles had stopped about an hour after we made camp, replaced by something worse, footsteps circling our tents in a slow, measured pace. Not the random movement of an animal, but deliberate steps that would pause directly outside the tent wall, so close we could hear breathing that sounded wrong somehow, too deep and lasting too long. Like whoever was out there had lungs twice the size of a normal person. Kyle gripped his knife so tight I could hear the leather handle creaking, and I had my hand on the bear spray, though we both knew that wouldn't help if a person really wanted to hurt us. Around midnight, Megan started crying in the tent next to ours, these quiet, muffled sobs while Jason whispered to her that everything would be okay, that we'd hike out first thing in the morning and report all of this to the rangers. Then Christopher's voice came from his solo tent, high and stretched thin with panic, saying someone was pressing against his tent wall, that he could see the outline of hands pushing in against the fabric. The next part happened so fast that even now, sitting here typing this out, I struggle to put the sequence of events in the right order. There was a sound like fabric tearing, but amplified, like someone had put a microphone next to ripping canvas, and Christopher just started screaming. Not words, but this raw, primal sound I'd never heard a human make before. Kyle and I burst out of our tent at the same time Jason emerged from his, all of us holding our phones with the flashlight function on, the beams swinging wildly through the darkness. Christopher's tent was still standing, but he was gone. Just gone, with a vertical slit down the side exactly like the ones we'd seen at the abandoned camp. His sleeping bag was still zipped up inside, his backpack untouched. but in the dirt outside the tear we could see drag marks leading away into the darkness, along with those same boot prints he'd been wearing. Except between each footprint there were these other impressions, like someone had been walking on their knuckles alongside him, keeping pace. Jason wanted to follow the tracks immediately, but Megan became hysterical, grabbing his arm and screaming that we needed to leave now, that we needed to run back down the trail in the dark rather than wait for whatever took Christopher to come back. While they argued, Kyle and I stood there with our lights pointed at the darkness where the tracks disappeared, and that's when we saw them, eyes reflecting our lights from at least a dozen different positions among the rocks and trees, all at different heights, like some were crouching and others were standing on elevated positions. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us as we slowly backed toward our tents to grab our packs. We didn't even stuff our sleeping bags, just shoved whatever we could into our backpacks in seconds and started running down the trail in the opposite direction from those eyes, Megan's sobbing echoing off the canyon walls as we stumbled through the darkness with only our phone lights to guide us. Though mine died completely, about 10 minutes into our desperate escape. What followed was 3 hours of pure terror that I can only remember in fragments, like my brain refused to properly record what was happening. We ran until our legs gave out, then walked, then ran again whenever we heard those whistles starting up behind us, always maintaining that same triangulated pattern but getting closer each time. At some point, Kyle just vanished. 1 second he was right beside me. The next there was nothing but empty trail, and his phone lying cracked on the ground, still showing the flashlight screen. I picked it up and kept moving because stopping meant joining him in whatever had happened. Jason and Megan were somewhere ahead of me, but their voices grew fainter until I couldn't hear them at all. Just my own ragged breathing and the sound of pursuit that never quite caught up, but never fell behind either. The trail split and merged and split again, or maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion and dehydration. But I kept moving through brush that tore at my clothes and rocks that shredded my hands when I fell, which was often. Dawn found me stumbling along a service road I didn't recognize. My boots gone, though I don't remember taking them off or losing them, my feet bleeding and swollen from walking on rocks and gravel. A park maintenance crew found me sitting in the middle of the road, unable to tell them anything coherent except that we weren't alone out there, which I must have repeated dozens of times based on what the rescue coordinator told me later. They searched for 72 straight hours using helicopters, dogs, and volunteer teams, eventually finding our abandoned campsite and the tracks that led to a cliff edge where everything just stopped. All the boot prints, the drag marks, even those strange knuckle impressions just ended at a sheer drop with no bodies below. No equipment, nothing. The official report lists them all as missing, presumed dead from a fall, but they never found any remains, and the investigators couldn't explain the abandoned camp we'd found, or why my friend's tracks seemed to show them walking calmly to the cliff edge, in a perfect single-file line based on the spacing, not running or struggling, but walking with measured, identical steps, like they were following something that left no tracks of its own. The Cascade Range has always been my escape from the chaos of Seattle. Every summer since college, those mountains called to me like an old friend, and this particular June in 2022 was no different. The guided trek advertised on the outdoor recreation board at REI seemed perfect. 3 days through lesser-known trails with a small group, led by someone who knew every rock and route along the path. 8 strangers total, including myself and the guide, all seeking something in those ancient peaks. Born in 1990, the same year Mount Redoubt erupted in Alaska, my mother always joked that mountains were in my blood from day one. What none of us knew was that we'd become one of those stories other hikers whisper about around campfires, the kind that makes people check their GPS twice and stay closer to established trails. My alarm went off at 4 in the morning that Tuesday, and by 5:30, I was pulling into the gravel parking area near Snoqualmie Pass, where we'd all agreed to meet before carpooling to the actual trailhead. The guide, a woman named Diane with silver streaks through her braided hair and laugh lines that suggested years of mountain sunshine, was already there, organizing gear in the back of her Subaru Outback. 2 other cars sat nearby, a dusty blue pickup with Idaho plates and a newer Toyota 4Runner that still had the dealership frame. The morning air carried that specific Pacific Northwest chill that promises heat later but demands layers now, and I remember zipping my fleece up to my chin while making awkward small talk with the others as they arrived. By 6:15, our complete group had assembled. Besides Diane and myself, there was a couple from Portland celebrating their 10th anniversary, 2 college buddies from Tacoma who kept making inside jokes about their fraternity days, a solo hiker named Walter who barely spoke above a whisper, and a woman around my age named Grace who worked as a nurse at Harborview Medical Center. We transferred our gear into 2 vehicles, Diane's Subaru and the 4Runner, which belonged to one of the Tacoma guys, and began the hour-long drive to the actual trailhead. The whole way there, Diane talked about the route, how we'd be following an old Forest Service trail that connected to a series of alpine lakes, most of which didn't even have official names, just numbers assigned by long-dead surveyors. The trailhead parking area was nothing more than a widened shoulder along a Forest Service road, marked only by a wooden post with the number 12 carved deep into the weathered grain. That marker would haunt me for months afterward, appearing in dreams where the numbers seemed to bleed sap like an open wound. Diane distributed the group gear among us: water purification tablets, first aid supplies, emergency beacons that she assured us we wouldn't need, but protocol demanded. The morning had warmed considerably by then, steam rising from the damp earth where sunshine broke through the canopy, and everything smelled like pine resin and moss. We signed the trail register attached to the post, each of us printing our names and emergency contacts in the rain-spotted notebook, never imagining those would be the last words some of us would ever write. The first few miles were exactly what you'd expect from a Cascade trail in early summer. Switchbacks through Douglas firs, occasional glimpses of snow-capped peaks through breaks in the trees, and the constant sound of water running somewhere just out of sight. Grace walked beside me for a while, talking about her shifts in the emergency room, how hiking helped her decompress from seeing humanity at its worst. The Portland couple, who introduced themselves as Tom and Heather, took photos at every scenic spot, their matching hiking boots and coordinated outdoor gear making them look like a REI catalog spread. But it was Walter who caught my attention most. He kept stopping every few hundred yards, not to catch his breath or admire the view, but to stare back down the trail we just climbed, his head tilted like he was listening for something specific. Around noon, we reached a small clearing where Diane suggested we break for lunch. The Tacoma guys, Aaron and Josh, had brought a portable speaker and started playing classic rock, which earned them a gentle but firm talking to from Diane about respecting the wilderness experience. While we ate our trail mix and sandwiches, Diane pulled out a laminated map and showed us our route. We'd camp tonight near the first alpine lake, tomorrow night at a higher elevation near a ridge she called the Sidewalk because of how flat and narrow it was, then loop back to the cars on day 3. She pointed to various landmarks, her finger tracing the dotted line of our path, but when she got to explaining the section after mile marker 12, her voice changed slightly, became more businesslike, almost rehearsed. "This part can be tricky," she said, tapping the map, "so we'll need to stay close together tomorrow morning." The afternoon hike grew progressively stranger, though nothing I could specifically point to as wrong. The forest seemed to swallow sound in odd ways. Aaron would be talking loudly just ahead of me, then his voice would cut out completely for a second before returning, like someone had briefly muted the world. Birds called from the canopy but never showed themselves, and twice I could have sworn I heard footsteps matching ours from somewhere off-trail. That peculiar rhythm of boots on earth that's unmistakable once you know it. When I mentioned it to Grace, she nodded slowly and admitted she'd been hearing it too. But when we told Diane, she just smiled and said the forest plays tricks. That sound bounces weird off the valley walls. Her explanation made perfect sense, but the way Walter immediately stepped closer to our group when she said it suggested he wasn't buying it either. We reached the first lake just before 5 that evening. a pristine circle of blue-green water surrounded by granite boulders and scraggly pines that had fought their way through cracks in the stone. The campsite was gorgeous, flat spots for tents, an established fire ring from previous hikers, and a view across the water to where the setting sun would paint the peaks orange and pink. While setting up camp, I noticed Josh filming everything with his phone, narrating in that influencer voice people use when they think they're creating content. "Day 1 of our epic Cascade adventure," he said to the camera, panning across our camp, and I remember thinking how stupid we all looked through that screen, like actors who didn't know our parts yet. Tom and Heather had brought a 2-person tent that they struggled with for 20 minutes before Aaron helped them figure out the rainfly, and Walter chose a spot far from everyone else, almost at the edge of where the forest started again, his small green tent looking like it wanted to disappear into the trees. Dinner was freeze-dried pad thai and instant mashed potatoes cooked on portable stoves, eaten while sitting on logs around the fire Diane had built with practiced efficiency. The conversation stayed light, everyone sharing their worst hiking experiences, funny animal encounters, the usual trail talk that bonds strangers who've chosen to walk into the wilderness together. But underneath it all was this weird tension, like we were all pretending not to notice something important. Grace kept checking her phone even though we had no signal, the screen's blue glow making her face look ghostly in the growing darkness. Around 9, just as the last light was fading from the sky, Walter suddenly stood up from where he'd been sitting silent at the edge of our circle and announced he was going back to his tent. "Need to write some things down," he said, patting a journal he pulled from his jacket pocket, and the way he looked at each of us, making deliberate eye contact like he was memorizing our faces, made my chest tighten with an anxiety I couldn't name. That night I woke up at what my watch said was 2:43 in the morning to the sound of someone walking through our camp. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling each tent in what seemed like a methodical pattern. Through the thin nylon of my tent wall, I could see a flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, too bright to be anyone's headlamp from our group. I held my breath, waiting for Diane's voice to ask if everything was okay, or for one of the guys to call out, but nobody said anything. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent for what must have been 30 seconds but felt like hours, and I could hear breathing, heavy and slightly ragged like someone who'd been running. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light clicked off and the footsteps moved away, not back toward any of our tents but straight into the forest, branches snapping and undergrowth rustling until the sounds faded into the ambient noise of wind through trees and water lapping at the lakeshore. The next morning at breakfast, I asked if anyone else had heard the footsteps, trying to keep my voice casual while spooning instant oatmeal into my mouth. Grace immediately said yes, her relief visible that someone else had experienced it. And surprisingly, it was quiet Walter who spoke up next. "Counted the steps," he said, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. 42 around each tent. Exact same number, exact same pattern. Diane listened to all of this with the expression I couldn't read, then explained that sometimes other hikers camped nearby, that the lake was popular despite being off the main trails. But when Tom asked why someone would circle our tents at 3 in the morning, she just shrugged and changed the subject to our route for the day. As we packed up camp, I noticed Josh reviewing videos on his phone from the night before, his face growing increasingly pale. When I asked what was wrong, he turned the screen toward me. In the background of a video he'd taken of the sunset, just at the edge of frame, there was a figure standing in the trees, completely still, watching our camp. The timestamp showed 7:23 in the evening, a full 2 hours before Walter had gone to his tent, 4 hours before the midnight visitor. We hit the trail by 8, everyone quieter than the day before, that forced cheerfulness from yesterday replaced by a watchful tension that made the forest feel hostile instead of peaceful. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up toward the ridge Diane had called the sidewalk, and with each turn, I found myself looking back, expecting to see someone following. About 2 miles in, we passed another wooden post, this one marked with the number 11, and Diane picked up her pace noticeably, urging us to keep together, keep moving. We wanted to make good time to the next camp. The forest changed as we climbed. The Douglas firs gave way to subalpine species, mountain hemlock and whitebark pine twisted by decades of harsh winters, and the undergrowth thinned out, leaving nowhere for anyone to hide. Yet that feeling of being watched only intensified, like the trees themselves had developed eyes. And when we finally reached mile marker 12 just before noon, Diane stopped so abruptly that Aaron almost ran into her back. The marker was different from the others. While 11 and the original trailhead marker had been simple posts with carved numbers, 12 was surrounded by a circle of stones, each one roughly the size of a human head, placed with deliberate precision. Inside the circle, the ground was bare dirt, compacted and smooth like it had been swept clean recently, and in the center sat a pile of hiking boots, at least a dozen pairs, arranged in a neat pyramid. Some looked decades old, leather cracked and laces rotted away, while others seemed almost new, including a pair of those expensive Salomon trail runners I'd seen at REI just last month. Heather made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, and Tom pulled her close, but it was Grace who voiced what we were all thinking. Those belonged to people. Where are the people? Diane stood frozen, her face drained of all color, and for the first time since we'd met her, she looked genuinely afraid. This wasn't here last month, she whispered, and that's when we heard it. A whistle, long and low, coming from somewhere up the trail, followed by another from behind us, and then another from our left, like we were being triangulated. Walter dropped his pack and started running back down the trail before anyone could react, his journal falling from his pocket and landing in the dirt near the marker. Josh grabbed it, whether out of instinct or curiosity I don't know, and flipped it open to the last entry dated that morning. They're not following us, they're hurting us. Every sound, every sighting pushing us toward marker 12. I should have left last night when I had the chance, but I needed to warn the others. If you're reading this, don't go past the stones. The bones are under the stones. God help us all. The whistles were getting closer, and now we could hear branches breaking, deliberate and unhurried, like whatever was coming knew we had nowhere to run. Diane suddenly snapped back into guide mode, shouting for everyone to stay together, to head for the ridge where we'd have better visibility. But Tom and Heather were already backing away, and Aaron was pulling Josh toward a gap in the trees, everyone scattering in different directions despite her commands. I ran with Grace and Diane, the three of us crashing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes and packs, our breathing ragged and desperate. Behind us, the whistling had stopped, which was somehow worse than hearing it. And then came sounds I'll never forget. Screaming, but cut short, like someone had hit a mute button mid-cry. First from the direction Tom and Heather had gone, then from where Aaron and Josh had disappeared, and finally, most horribly, from back down the trail where Walter had fled. Grace was crying as we ran, and Diane kept repeating, almost there, like a mantra, leading us up a steep scramble of rocks toward the ridgeline. We burst out of the tree line onto the sidewalk, a narrow spine of granite with 1,000-foot drops on either side, and for a moment we just stood there, gasping, scanning the forest below for any sign of the others. That's when Josh's phone, which I didn't even realize I'd picked up when it fell from his pack, started recording on its own, the screen showing the video app active despite no one touching it. We stayed on that ridge for 6 hours, afraid to go back down, using Diane's emergency beacon to call for help that would take until nightfall to arrive. The search and rescue team found our campsite exactly as the reports would later describe. Tent still standing, food still in the pot over dead coals like we'd just stepped away for a moment, and 7 phones arranged in a perfect circle around the fire pit, all recording nothing but wind and static. They never found Tom, Heather, Aaron, Josh, or Walter, just their boots added to the pile at marker 12, which had somehow grown to include fresh pairs despite the area being sealed off within hours. Grace and I were evacuated by helicopter, both of us dehydrated and in shock, unable to explain what had happened in any way that made sense. Diane quit guiding after that, moved to Arizona last I heard, somewhere far from mountains and trees. The official report blamed our panic on a wildlife encounter, maybe a bear or mountain lion, and the disappearances on people getting lost after separating from the group. But they never explained the boots or the stones, or why every recording device captured the same static pattern that, when analyzed, contained what audio experts described as organized but non-human vocalizations. 3 weeks after the rescue, when the story had faded from the news and the trail had been officially closed pending investigation, a ranger found my car still parked at the original trailhead. The strange thing was, I'd driven home with Grace that day. We both remembered getting in her Honda and leaving my vehicle behind in our panic to get away. But there it was, keys in the ignition, my journal on the passenger seat open to a page I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine, but shaky, desperate, and all it said over and over was, "Don't go past mile marker 12," filling 3 entire pages. The last entry, dated the day after our rescue, was different. They let 3 leave so 3 could tell. The mountain needs its witnesses. Every generation, new boots for the pile, new stones for the circle. We were never lost. We were chosen. And some of us chose wrong. The police couldn't explain how my car got there, or how a journal entry could be dated after I was already home. And the therapist I've been seeing says, trauma can cause memory gaps, dissociative episodes where people do things they don't remember. I moved to Florida 6 months ago, as far from mountains as I could get. But sometimes I still wake up at 2:43 in the morning to the sound of whistling outside my window, even though I live on the 7th floor of a building surrounded by ocean. Grace calls me occasionally, always during daylight hours, and we dance around talking about what really happened, focusing instead on our new lives in flat places with no trees. Last week she mentioned finding a pair of hiking boots in her closet that she didn't remember buying. Still tagged from REI, exactly her size. I found a similar pair in my apartment yesterday, pristine Salomons that fit perfectly, and when I picked them up to throw them away, dirt fell from the treads. Dirt and small granite pebbles like the ones that surrounded marker 12. I haven't told anyone this, probably won't, but I've been having dreams where I'm back on that trail, except this time I'm the one whistling, the one walking through camps at night, counting 42 steps around each tent. In the dreams, I understand why it has to happen, why the mountain chooses who stays and who leaves, but I always wake up before I can remember the reason. All I know for certain is what I wrote in that journal, even if I can't remember writing it. If you find this, don't go past mile marker 12. "40 miles outside Asheville, tucked between ridges where cell service barely existed, stood this cabin my college roommate Victor found on some sketchy rental site for dirt cheap. January in the Appalachians meant snow packed 3 feet deep in some spots, ice coating every surface after dark, and temperatures that could kill you if you stayed outside too long without proper gear. At 28, teaching high school biology in Charlotte, I needed that isolation more than I cared to admit. Grading papers and dealing with parents had worn me down to nothing by winter break. Victor organized the whole weekend, convinced us all to drive up that Friday afternoon in 2 cars. Me, Victor, his girlfriend Allison, my buddy Cameron from work, plus Zoe and Bennett who we knew from our old trivia team downtown. Nobody questioned why the place cost so little, though we should have wondered why the owner rarely bothered maintaining it, why previous renters left such vague reviews online. Cameron stood out among us for all the wrong reasons. Rail thin, perpetually anxious, the kind of guy who apologized for everything even when nothing needed apologizing for. While the rest of us unpacked groceries and argued about sleeping arrangements, he chain-smoked on the porch, tapping ash into an empty beer bottle he carried everywhere like some kind of security blanket. The cabin itself felt ancient, all dark wood paneling and furniture that belonged in somebody's grandmother's house circa 1975, complete with those creepy taxidermied deer heads watching us from every wall. Victor found this ancient motion sensor camera mounted by the back door, the kind hunters use to track game, covered in rust and barely functioning. We joked about it recording Bigfoot or catching bears going through the trash, never imagining we'd actually need to check what it captured. That first night passed normally enough, We drank too much bourbon, played cards until 3 in the morning, told the same college stories we always told when we got together. Saturday dragged by in a blur of hangovers and lazy conversation, everyone nursing coffee and picking at leftover pizza while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Around 9 that evening, just as we started heating up dinner, Cameron announced he needed a cigarette and headed for the back door, wearing nothing but jeans and this ratty Nirvana t-shirt he'd owned since freshman year. Allison called after him to grab his coat. The thermometer by the window showed 12 degrees, but he waved her off, said he'd only be a minute, just needed a quick smoke before we ate. We kept cooking, Victor stirring pasta while Zoe set the table, Bennett hunting through cabinets for plates that weren't chipped or stained. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and Allison started getting annoyed because the food was ready and Cameron knew we were about to eat. Victor went to the back door, yanked it open, cold air rushing in like water breaking through a dam, and called Cameron's name into the darkness. No answer came back, just wind rattling through bare branches, and that peculiar silence you only get in mountains during winter, when snow muffles everything until the world feels wrapped in cotton. We figured Cameron had wandered around to the front porch, maybe got distracted looking at stars. The sky up there stretched endless and clear, no light pollution for miles. So Bennett checked out front while I grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam across the backyard. His footprints led straight from the door to a cluster of pine trees about 30 yards away, clear as anything in the fresh snow, but they didn't come back. The tracks just ended at the tree line, like he'd stood there for a while then simply vanished into thin air. Victor kept insisting Cameron must have walked along the trees, maybe circled around to smoke somewhere else. But we all saw the same thing. One set of prints going out, nothing coming back, and beyond those pines stretched miles of wilderness where the temperature would kill you before dawn if you got lost. Panic set in differently for each of us. Allison started crying immediately. Zoe pulled out her phone even though we all knew there was no signal. Bennett ran inside to check every room like Cameron might be hiding in a closet playing some sick joke. Victor and I grabbed better flashlights, 2 heavy mag lights we found under the kitchen sink, and followed those footprints to where they ended, examining the ground for any sign of which direction Cameron might have gone. The snow past the tree line lay pristine, untouched. Not even animal tracks marking its surface, just smooth white extending into darkness between the trunks. We screamed his name until our throats went raw, the sound echoing off the mountain before dying in that oppressive quiet, and all I could think about was Cameron out there in a t-shirt. No coat, no gloves, probably dead already from hypothermia if he'd wandered too far. After an hour of searching, Victor remembered the motion sensor camera by the back door, that rusty thing we'd laughed about earlier, and suggested we check if it caught anything when Cameron went outside. The camera used these ancient SD cards, the kind from 15 years ago, and we had to dig through 3 laptops before finding one old enough to read it properly. We crowded around Zoe's ancient ThinkPad, 6 people breathing too loud in that cramped living room, waiting for the files to load while wind howled against the windows like something trying to get inside. The camera had triggered at 9:07 p.m. according to the timestamp, grainy black and white footage showing Cameron stepping out the back door, cigarette already between his lips, that empty beer bottle in his left hand for the ashes. He walked those 30 yards to the pine trees exactly like his footprints showed, stopped right at the edge where forest met yard, and just stood there facing the woods, not moving, not smoking, just standing perfectly still like someone had pressed pause on him. For 23 minutes, we watched every second. Cameron remained frozen in place while snow accumulated on his shoulders, never lighting that cigarette, never shifting his weight, never even turning his head when a deer passed within 10 feet of him around the 15-minute mark. Then, at exactly 9:30 p.m., he started walking forward into the woods with the same mechanical pace you'd use crossing a parking lot. No hesitation, no looking around, just walking straight ahead like someone had called his name from deep in those trees. The camera's range only covered about 50 feet past the tree line, but we watched him disappear into that darkness, barefoot. And this detail made everyone gasp, because somewhere between the door and the trees, he'd removed his boots and socks, left them placed neatly side by side in the snow, where we hadn't noticed them in our panic. Allison grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, whispered that people don't just walk into freezing woods barefoot, that something must have been wrong with Cameron before we even came up here. Maybe he'd been planning this all along. But I knew Cameron for 3 years, saw him every day at work, ate lunch with him in the teacher's lounge discussing lesson plans and complaining about standardized testing, and nothing about him suggested suicidal thoughts or mental illness beyond the general anxiety we all carried around like background noise. Victor rewound the footage, played it again frame by frame, and we noticed something else that made everyone stop breathing for a moment. About 5 minutes before Cameron moved, barely visible at the edge of the camera's range, another figure stood between the trees. Just a shadow, really, could have been anything. A trick of the light or a tree trunk shaped weird. Except it wasn't there in the frames before or after those specific 5 minutes. And it seemed to shift slightly, swaying like someone doing that thing where you rock from foot to foot when you're waiting for something. Nobody wanted to say what we all thought, that someone had been out there watching Cameron, maybe calling to him somehow without making a sound we could hear, because acknowledging that meant accepting that our friend hadn't just wandered off in some fugue state, but had been lured into those woods by someone or something that knew exactly what they were doing. Bennett called 911 on the landline, the old rotary phone in the kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the cabin was built, and after explaining our situation 3 times to different dispatchers, they said search and rescue couldn't mobilize until morning due to the weather. Snow had picked up to near blizzard conditions, visibility down to nothing, too dangerous for helicopters or ground teams. We made our own search parties anyway, stupid and desperate, trudging through thigh-deep snow with flashlights that barely cut through the swirling white, screaming ourselves hoarse while knowing that Cameron had been out there over 2 hours now in nothing but jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot in sub-freezing temperatures. Victor and I pushed deepest into the woods, following what we thought might be footprints but turned out to be shadows and fallen branches, getting turned around twice before realizing we could die out there just as easily as Cameron, that the mountain didn't care about our friendship or guilt or need to find him. By midnight, we'd given up actively searching, huddled in the living room with every light in the cabin blazing, taking turns watching the back door like Cameron might walk through at any second with some ridiculous explanation about getting lost or finding another cabin where people invited him in for drinks. Around 3 in the morning, Zoe noticed something that made us check the footage one more time. Cameron's cigarette, the one he'd held but never smoked, wasn't in his hand when he walked into the woods. We scrubbed through the video until we found it. At the 19-minute mark, his right hand opened and the cigarette fell into the snow, followed immediately by the beer bottle from his left hand, both dropping like his fingers just stopped working. But here's what really disturbed us. His expression never changed. That blank stare never wavered, even as objects fell from his hands like his brain had disconnected from his body entirely. Victor pulled up articles on his phone about hypothermic paradox, that thing where freezing people strip their clothes off because they feel hot, but the temperature hadn't been cold enough for that severe of a reaction in such a short time, and it didn't explain the 23 minutes of absolute stillness, or the way he'd walked into those woods with such purposeful, measured steps. Search and rescue arrived at first light, a team of 8 people with dogs and thermal imaging equipment, real professionals who took one look at the footage and immediately called in state police. The lead officer, this weathered woman named Sergeant Fuller, who'd worked mountain rescues for 15 years, watched the video 3 times before asking if Cameron had any history of sleepwalking, seizure disorders, or drug use, particularly dissociatives like ketamine or PCP that could cause catatonic states. We told her about the shadow figure in the trees, pointed it out on the laptop screen, and she made notes but said nothing, just exchanged this look with her partner that suggested they'd seen something like this before. The dogs picked up Cameron's scent immediately, followed it about 200 yards into the woods before losing it at a small frozen creek, the handlers explaining that he must have walked through the water for some distance, though why anyone would wade through ice water barefoot in January defied all logic, unless they specifically wanted to throw off tracking dogs. They found Cameron's body 6 hours later, 4 miles from the cabin in a ravine nobody would accidentally stumble into, seated upright against a fallen log with his arms crossed over his chest, like he'd arranged himself for a formal portrait before dying. The medical examiner ruled it death by exposure, no signs of violence or drugs in his system, just a man who walked into the woods and sat down to die for reasons nobody could explain. But Sergeant Fuller pulled me aside before they left, asked if we'd noticed anything strange about the cabin itself, any weird feelings or odd dreams the night before Cameron disappeared. And when I said no, she handed me her card and said something I'll never forget. Sometimes these old mountain properties have histories we don't advertise to tourists, and sometimes people sensitive to those histories respond in ways that don't make sense to the rest of us. We left that afternoon, nobody wanting to spend another night in that place, and during the drive home I finally looked up the cabin's address and found 3 similar incidents over 40 years. People walking into those same woods in winter, always underdressed, always at night, always found later in that same ravine positioned peacefully like they'd chosen to be there. The year was 2015, middle of July, and at 12 years old, summer camp seemed like the perfect escape from my parents' divorce proceedings. Camp Whispering Pines sat deep in the Sawtooth Mountains, surrounded by nothing but wilderness for miles in every direction. The brochure promised 2 weeks of hiking, swimming, and campfires, but what happened that summer still keeps me awake at night, even now at 21. My cabin group had 8 kids, all around my age, supervised by 2 college-aged counselors who spent more time flirting with each other than watching us. The camp itself consisted of wooden cabins arranged in a semicircle around a main lodge, with trails branching off into the forest like veins. Everything felt normal those first 3 days, just kids being kids, until that Wednesday afternoon when I decided to explore beyond the marked trails during our free period. The counselors always told us to stay on the designated paths, but boredom makes you stupid when you're 12. About 20 minutes into my solo adventure, pushing through thick undergrowth that scratched at my legs, I stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. Hidden behind a cluster of pine trees, someone had built a crude shelter using tarps and branches, barely visible unless you were right on top of it. The blue tarp was weathered and torn in places, held down by rocks and rope tied to nearby trees. Inside, scattered across the dirt floor, were empty food wrappers from brands I recognized from our camp store, a filthy sleeping bag that reeked of sweat, and something else I couldn't identify. And what made my chest tighten with unease, a small purple backpack with cartoon unicorns on it, definitely belonging to a young child. My first instinct was to grab the backpack and run, but curiosity won over fear. Opening it with trembling fingers, I found a name written in marker on the inside flap, Lily Anderson, age 7, along with crayons, a coloring book, and a stuffed rabbit missing one eye. The pages in the coloring book were filled with disturbing drawings. Not typical kid stuff, but dark scribbles, and what looked like a tall figure standing over smaller shapes. Some pages had words written in shaky handwriting. He comes at night and wants to play games, repeated over and over. The sleeping bag had dark stains on it that I didn't want to think too hard about, and beneath it, partially buried in the dirt, I spotted what looked like strips of duct tape. That finally broke through my curiosity, sending me scrambling backwards out of the shelter, leaves crunching loudly under my feet as I ran back toward camp. Brian and Kevin, our counselors, were sitting on the lodge porch when I burst out of the tree line, gasping for air and trying to explain what I'd found. Brian, who couldn't have been older than 19, barely glanced up from his phone while Kevin laughed and ruffled my hair, telling me I'd probably just found some old campsite from hikers passing through. They said the mountains were full of people doing the trail systems, leaving stuff behind all the time, nothing to worry about. When I insisted about the child's backpack and the weird drawings, Brian finally looked at me and said, "Kids from town sometimes came up here to play in the woods, probably just forgot their stuff. Neither of them would come look at it with me, saying I shouldn't have been off the trail anyway and threatening to call my parents if I kept making up stories. The way they dismissed everything so quickly made anger burn in my chest. But what could a 12-year-old do against adults who wouldn't listen? That evening at dinner, I tried telling some of the other kids in my cabin about what I'd found, but most were too busy talking about the capture the flag game planned for the next day. Only Timothy, this quiet kid with thick glasses who read horror novels during rest time, seemed interested. He whispered that he'd heard strange noises the past 2 nights, like footsteps circling our cabin, but figured it was just counselors doing bed checks. We made plans to sneak out together the next day to look at the shelter, though neither of us really wanted to go back there. The cafeteria buzzed with normal camp chatter, complaints about the meatloaf, excitement about tomorrow's activities, gossip about which counselors were dating, while I pushed food around my plate, unable to stop thinking about those drawings and that missing girl's backpack. After dinner, during the nightly campfire, I kept scanning the dark tree line, expecting to see someone watching us, but there was only blackness beyond the fire's glow. The singing and s'mores ended around 9:30, and we all trudged back to our cabins for lights out at 10. Our cabin had 4 bunk beds, with me on a bottom bunk near the window, Timothy above me, and 6 other boys scattered throughout the room. Brian did a half-hearted head count, told us to keep it down, and left for the counselor's quarters, leaving us in darkness except for the moonlight filtering through thin curtains. Most of the guys fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's hikes, but I lay awake listening to the forest sounds. Crickets, wind through pine needles, the occasional crack of a branch. Around what must have been midnight, judging by the moon's position, those normal sounds stopped completely, leaving an unnatural silence that made my ears ring. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel path outside, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside our cabin wall. The footsteps moved along the exterior wall, pausing at each window, and I could hear breathing, deep, ragged breathing that didn't sound quite right, like someone with fluid in their lungs. When the shadow passed my window, I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the sleeping bag over my head, but I could still hear it. Then came the whispering, barely audible at first, but growing clearer as whatever it was pressed closer to the walls. It was saying our names, one by one, in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. Timothy, Matthew, Samuel. Each name drawn out, savored almost, and when it reached mine, the voice lingered, repeating it 3 times before moving on. Above me, I felt Timothy's bunk shake slightly. He was awake too, probably terrified like me. The whispering continued for maybe 10 minutes, circling our cabin twice, sometimes adding weird phrases between the names. Come play. The mountain is hungry. Lily wants friends. That last one made bile rise in my throat because I hadn't told anyone else about finding Lily's name in that backpack. By the time the footsteps finally retreated into the forest, my pillowcase was soaked with sweat and my jaw ached from clenching it so tight. I waited another hour before daring to whisper Timothy's name, and he immediately responded with a shaky, "Did you hear that too?" We stayed up the rest of the night talking in hushed voices, trying to make sense of what happened, both of us too scared to get up and find the counselors. When dawn finally broke around 5:30, painting the cabin in pale orange light, we noticed something that made our conversation die mid-sentence. Samuel's bed, 2 bunks over from mine, was empty, his sleeping bag unzipped and thrown aside like he'd left in a hurry. But Samuel was the heaviest sleeper in our cabin, the kid who once slept through a thunderstorm that shook the walls, and none of us had heard him get up during the night. Timothy and I exchanged panicked looks before I finally worked up the courage to check the cabin door, which should have been locked from the inside, but now stood slightly ajar, mud smeared across the handle. The chaos that erupted when we woke Brian was like nothing I'd ever seen at camp before. His face went from annoyed to pale in seconds when he saw Samuel's empty bed, and suddenly the lazy counselor transformed into someone barking orders and making frantic phone calls. Within an hour, the entire camp was in lockdown mode, with counselors counting and recounting kids, the camp director calling the local sheriff's department, and parent phone trees being activated. They questioned all of us repeatedly. When did we last see Samuel? Did he say anything about leaving? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? Timothy and I told them about the whispering and footsteps, and this time, Brian actually listened, his face growing more concerned with each detail. The sheriff arrived with a search and rescue team around 8 that morning, their dogs immediately picking up a scent trail leading from our cabin toward the forest. What really got everyone's attention, though, were the footprints in the mud outside, adult-sized boots heading toward the woods, and smaller barefoot prints that matched Samuel's size walking alongside them, not dragged or struggling, just walking like he'd chosen to go. The search team spent all morning combing through the woods while we were kept in the main lodge, parents being called to pick up their kids early. Around noon, one of the dogs led them straight to that hidden shelter I'd found, which was now empty except for fresh candy wrappers and something that made my whole body go cold: Samuel's inhaler, which he never went anywhere without, sitting right on top of that stained sleeping bag. The sheriff's team found more tracks leading deeper into the mountains, following old mining paths that hadn't been used in decades, but the trail went cold at a creek about 2 miles from camp. They brought in helicopters, more dogs, even volunteers from town. But as the afternoon wore on, the grim expressions on the adults' faces told us what nobody wanted to say out loud. My dad arrived around 4 to take me home, and as we drove away, I saw them bringing in more police cars and what looked like FBI agents, their black SUVs pulling up to the camp entrance. The story should have ended there, with a missing kid and a closed camp, but 3 days later something happened that still haunts me. Samuel walked out of the forest on his own, found by hikers about 15 miles from camp, dehydrated and confused but physically unharmed. The news called it a miracle. His parents cried on TV thanking everyone who searched, and the camp director gave statements about improved safety protocols. But Timothy and I stayed in touch, and he told me what Samuel said when he finally came back to school that fall. The story he only shared with a few kids before his parents moved them across the country. Samuel claimed he didn't remember leaving the cabin, just waking up in the woods with a tall man who had scars covering his neck and arms, living in different makeshift camps, moving every day. The man called himself Uncle Roy and said he was protecting special children from the mountain spirits, that he'd been collecting kids for years to keep them safe. Samuel remembered other children too, maybe 3 or 4, hiding in caves during the day, including a little girl who matched the age Lily would have been, though she never spoke, just drew pictures constantly with crayons. According to Samuel, on the 3rd night, Uncle Roy got spooked by something, packed up their camp in minutes, and told Samuel he wasn't ready yet before pointing him toward a trail and disappearing into the darkness. The police never found any Uncle Roy, no other children, no caves matching Samuel's descriptions, nothing but more abandoned campsites scattered throughout those mountains. The official report blamed it on trauma-induced false memories, maybe Stockholm Syndrome, and the case was quietly closed. Camp Whispering Pines never reopened. The property sold to developers who turned it into vacation homes, and most people forgot about that strange week in 2015. But I know what I heard that night. Those whispers calling our names, and sometimes I wonder about all the missing hiker reports from that area over the years. I think about Lily Anderson, and whether she's still out there somewhere with Uncle Roy, drawing pictures in the dark, waiting for him to decide she's finally ready for whatever the mountain supposedly wants. I never went camping again after that summer, and even now, living in a city apartment far from any mountains, I still check my locks twice before bed and listen for footsteps that shouldn't be there. The dirt road to our campsite stretched for miles through Utah's backcountry, kicking up red dust that coated everything in the car. Hannah had her feet up on the dashboard, painting her toenails this bright purple color while I navigated the potholes and washouts. We'd been together long enough that these camping trips had become our ritual. Every few months we'd pack the Jeep and disappear into the wilderness for a weekend. She worked 12-hour shifts at the pediatric ward in Denver, and teaching biology to teenagers, Had me grading papers until midnight most nights, so by August we desperately needed this escape. The camping spot we'd found online was supposed to be this hidden plateau near Moab, far enough from the tourist trails that we'd have total privacy. After 4 hours of driving and another hour on unmarked roads, we finally reached the coordinates some random user had posted on a backcountry forum. Setting up camp on that clifftop felt like we'd discovered our own private paradise. The tent went up on this perfectly flat stretch of sandstone, maybe 50 feet from where the ground dropped away into a massive canyon system. Hannah started organizing our gear, while I gathered dead juniper branches for a fire, and we spent the afternoon exploring the rim trail and taking pictures of each other against the dramatic backdrop. Dinner was just freeze-dried pasta, but sitting there watching the rocks turn from orange to deep red to purple as the sun dropped made everything taste better. We were washing our dishes with the last of our water bottles when Hannah suddenly stopped mid-sentence and nodded toward the far side of the canyon. A figure stood at the opposite rim, probably 300 yards away but clearly visible against the lighter sky. Just standing there at the very edge, facing directly toward our camp, completely motionless like he'd been carved from the rock itself. We figured it was another camper enjoying the view. People did weird things in nature, and watching sunsets from dramatic vantage points wasn't unusual. But the guy never moved, not even to shift his weight or adjust his stance. Hannah waved at him, that friendly kind of wave you give other hikers on trails, but he didn't respond. After about 10 minutes of us periodically glancing over while we finished cleaning up, the darkness finally swallowed him up. We laughed about it, making jokes about meditation retreats and people taking those mindfulness apps too seriously. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, so we crawled into our sleeping bags early, played cards by headlamp for a while, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the canyon below. Nothing else seemed unusual that first night, just the typical sounds of the desert, little animals rustling in the brush, an owl calling somewhere in the distance. Saturday morning came bright and clear, with that intense desert sun that makes you grateful for any patch of shade. We made instant coffee on the camp stove and planned out a longer hike down into the canyon itself, following what looked like an old deer trail we'd spotted the day before. The whole day was fantastic. We found this hidden spring surrounded by cottonwood trees at the canyon bottom, saw a family of bighorn sheep navigating the cliff faces, and Hannah discovered some pottery shards that must have been centuries old. We made it back to camp around 5 in the afternoon, dusty and exhausted but exhilarated. While Hannah rested in the tent, I started preparing dinner, cutting up vegetables on our little folding table. That's when I noticed him again. Same spot on the opposite rim, same eerily still posture, facing our camp exactly like the night before. The unease hit me harder this time. Nobody stands in the exact same spot 2 evenings in a row, especially not at the edge of a cliff where one wrong step means certain death. I called Hannah out of the tent and pointed him out, and we both stared across the canyon trying to make out any details. He wore dark clothing, maybe black or deep brown, and had something covering his head, possibly a hood or a hat with a wide brim. We couldn't see his face clearly, but the way his body angled toward us left no doubt about where his attention was focused. Hannah suggested yelling across to him, asking if he needed help or something, but the canyon swallowed up her voice before it got halfway across. The wind had picked up, creating this low humming sound as it moved through the rock formations, and somehow that made the whole scene feel more isolated and wrong. We decided to eat dinner inside the tent that night, zipping up all the windows and trying to pretend everything was normal. But every few minutes, one of us would peek through the mesh window to check if he was still there. He was, for nearly 2 hours, until darkness finally erased him from view. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both kept our headlamps within easy reach and spoke in hushed voices like we might be overheard. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee, and as I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible, my headlamp beam swept across the ground near our car. There in the fine red dust were footprints, boots with deep treads, forming a complete circle around the vehicle. They weren't there when we'd parked, and they definitely weren't ours. My heart started hammering as I followed the tracks with my light, seeing how they came from the direction of the canyon rim, circled our car multiple times, then led straight toward our tent before veering off back into the darkness. I woke Hannah immediately, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what I'd found. She grabbed her headlamp and we both went outside, following the footprints together. The tracks stopped about 3 feet from our tent's rainfly, and there were deeper impressions there, like someone had stood in that spot for a long time, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Hannah found something else that made my mouth go dry. Cigarette butts, at least a dozen of them, crushed into the dirt right where the person had been standing. The brand was torn off each one, leaving just the white filters, and they were arranged in a small, deliberate pile. We'd been sleeping maybe 4 feet from where this stranger had been standing, smoking cigarettes and watching our tent in the darkness. The nearest ranger station was over 20 miles away on roads with no cell service, and our gas gauge had been hovering near empty since we'd arrived. We threw everything into the car in record time, not even bothering to properly pack the tent, just wadding it up and shoving it in the back. Hannah held a knife from our camp kitchen while I started the engine, and we both kept scanning the darkness beyond the headlights. The gas gauge needle sat just barely above the red line, and I knew the math didn't work. 20 miles of rough dirt road climbing up and down hills would drain what little fuel we had left, but staying felt impossible after seeing those footprints and cigarette butts. As I put the Jeep in reverse to turn around, the headlight swept across the canyon rim where the man had been standing. He was there again, visible in the beam for just a second, but this time he was moving, walking along the rim parallel to the direction we'd have to drive. Hannah saw him too, and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, whispering that he knew exactly which road we'd have to take out. We sat there with the engine running, weighing our options. The math was simple and terrifying. We had maybe enough gas for 15 miles if we drove carefully, but the main highway was over 20 miles away. The dirt road had several steep climbs that would burn fuel even faster. Staying meant spending the night with someone who'd already proven they could reach our camp unseen, someone who'd stood inches from where we slept. Going meant potentially getting stranded on a dark mountain road with this person knowing exactly where we'd be stuck. Hannah remembered seeing an old Forest Service cabin on our way in, maybe 8 miles back, with what looked like a radio antenna on the roof. It was a gamble, but 8 miles we could definitely make, and maybe the cabin would have emergency supplies or a way to call for help. I turned the Jeep toward the road, driving slowly to conserve fuel, while Hannah kept watch behind us with her headlamp, looking for any sign of following headlights. The road seemed different in the darkness, every shadow potentially hiding someone, every curve blind to what might be waiting ahead. We drove in tense silence, the fuel gauge dropping steadily toward empty. About 4 miles in, Hannah suddenly yelled for me to stop. There was a vehicle parked just off the road ahead, barely visible through the juniper trees. It was an old pickup truck, rust-colored or maybe just covered in dirt, with no lights on and positioned so it partially blocked the narrow road. We couldn't see if anyone was inside it. I reversed about 50 yards and found a spot where I could turn around if needed, keeping the engine running while we debated what to do. That's when we heard it. Another engine starting up behind us, back the direction of our campsite. No headlights appeared, but the sound grew steadily closer. Someone driving in complete darkness on roads that were treacherous even in daylight. Hannah made the decision for both of us. She grabbed the wheel and yanked it hard to the right, sending us crashing through the sagebrush and around the parked truck. We scraped past with inches to spare, the passenger mirror snapping off against its tailgate, and I floored it up the next hill. The gas gauge dropped into the red, and the engine started that stuttering hesitation that meant we were running on fumes. Behind us, headlights suddenly blazed to life, both from the parked truck and the vehicle that had been following. They lit up the dust cloud we'd left behind, and I could see them in the mirrors gaining on us fast. The Forest Service cabin appeared just as the engine died completely, our momentum carrying us into what used to be a parking area. It was more rundown than we'd realized passing it earlier. Windows boarded up, door hanging off its hinges. But Hannah was already out and running toward it before I'd even set the parking brake. The cabin was a mess inside, furniture overturned and graffiti covering the walls, but the radio setup in the corner still had power from a solar panel on the roof. Hannah figured out how to work it while I barricaded the door with everything I could move. Through the cracked boards over the windows, I could see headlights pulling into the parking area, then darkness as they switched them off. The radio crackled to life just as we heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside, and Hannah practically screamed our location and situation to whoever was listening. A ranger's voice came back, saying they were 45 minutes out, but they were coming with backup. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, methodically, stopping at each window. Then nothing. Just silence for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes. When we finally heard the approaching sirens and saw the emergency lights through the boards, we found the parking area empty except for our Jeep. The rangers said they'd passed no vehicles on the road coming up. Whoever it was had vanished into the wilderness, leaving only tire tracks and the memory of that terrible night. We never went camping in remote areas again. The air at Paradise Base that morning carried a strange stillness, the kind that made every sound sharper. I had been guiding climbs for almost a decade, and Mount Rainier was supposed to be routine compared to the Himalayas. My name's Daniel, and that week I was part of a 4-person team prepping for a technical ascent before the next storm front closed in. The mountain looked deceptively calm from below, sunlight hitting its ridges like polished glass, but everyone knew how fast it could turn. We were scheduled for a 5-day push, 2 nights at high camp, nothing extraordinary. Or at least that was the plan. Our team consisted of seasoned climbers. Emily, a paramedic from Montana with a quiet focus that made you trust her instantly. Marcus, the oldest of us, whose humor kept the air light even when conditions didn't. And Eric, a new addition who'd just returned from Denali. I had met Eric through a mutual friend, and though he was competent, there was something in his silence that I couldn't quite read. We spent the first day hiking through dense fog, the ice crunching under our crampons, our breath clouding like steam as we adjusted to the altitude. The climb itself felt routine, until we reached an area I didn't recognize on the map. The ridge flattened into a narrow plateau, a place scoured by wind and time. That was where we saw them. The remains of tents half buried in snow, guy lines torn and tangled, cooking gear scattered like someone had fled in a hurry. Marcus crouched down, brushing away the frost from a sleeping bag that had frozen stiff. "This wasn't here last season," he muttered. I noticed a torn patch of fabric marked with a logo from an old expedition company that had folded 2 years earlier. The same one connected to the missing team whose bodies were never recovered. We all went silent for a moment. The radio static broke the quiet, faint but distinct, as if whispering through the wind. That night, the mountain didn't rest. The wind roared against the fabric of our tents, and every now and then the static on the radio would spike into bursts. But it wasn't random. We could make out words. Our words. Conversations we had earlier that day, replaying with eerie precision, like the mountain itself had been listening. Emily tried to rationalize it, said the cold might have been interfering with the frequency, but I could tell she didn't believe it. None of us did. The air inside the tent felt charged, the kind of tension that makes you hesitate to even breathe too loudly. By the second night, the weather had started closing in. Clouds rolled down from the upper ridges like slow smoke, swallowing everything in white. We built snow walls around the tents and anchored them deeper, though the wind still managed to slip through in thin howls. I barely slept. The radio kept crackling, faint echoes of our voices rising and fading like they were being pulled apart. Around 3 a.m, Marcus swore he heard footsteps circling outside. He unzipped the tent, flashlight cutting through the snow, but there was no one there. Only the static, now louder, like heavy breathing between bursts of noise. Morning brought a grim silence. The storm had buried most of our tracks, but one was unmistakable. A single trail of fresh boot prints leading away from camp, heading higher into the slope. Eric was gone. His tent flap was open, his pack still inside, along with his gloves and rope harness. We called his name until our throats burned, but the mountain swallowed the sound whole. Emily wanted to go after him immediately, but climbing higher in that storm was suicide. We radioed base for help, but all we got back was a wall of interference, fragments of words we couldn't make out. As the hours dragged on, small things began to shift around camp. A carabiner that had been on the cooking line ended up half buried 10 meters away. My ice axe, which I'd left propped against a snow wall, was lying beside my tent with its handle cracked. Emily said she thought she saw someone moving near the edge of the ridge, a dark outline against the wind. But when we went to check, there was only open snow. That was when Marcus started saying we were being followed, that maybe Eric hadn't wandered off at all. His voice had that trembling edge that makes you realize fear is starting to win. That night, the static returned, not as background noise, but as a voice. It called each of our names, repeating them in order, with a delay that didn't match any radio pattern I'd ever heard. Sometimes it mimicked what we said seconds after we said it. Other times it whispered words none of us had spoken. Emily tried switching channels, but every frequency bled into the same hollow echo. The mountain sounded alive, and whatever it was, wind, interference, or something else entirely, it wanted us to hear it. By dawn, Marcus was gone too. His tent had collapsed under the snow, and only one line of prints led away, the same direction as Eric's. It did not make sense. No one would climb higher without gear or oxygen. Emily and I packed up what we could, planning to descend before the storm worsened. Every step felt like walking through static. The air hummed around us, and sometimes through the wind, I swore I heard Marcus shouting my name. It sounded close, but when I turned, the slope stretched empty in every direction. I stopped answering after a while. Midway down the glacier, our radio came alive again. The voice on the other end sounded like me. Same tone, same pauses, saying words I had not spoken yet. It repeated my last sentence seconds before I could finish it, overlapping itself like an echo that shouldn't exist. Emily dropped the radio in panic. When I picked it up, the voice changed. It was Eric now, calm and deliberate, saying, "You left me up here." The transmission cut into white noise so sharp it hurt to listen. We made it back to base late that night, frostbitten and half delirious. The rescue team that went up 2 days later found no trace of Marcus or Eric. Their prints stopped near a crevasse, but the snow had swallowed everything else. The old camp we found was gone too. Tents, gear, all of it buried under a fresh drift as if it had never existed. The only thing left behind was our broken radio, sitting on the surface where we had left it. Power light still flickering even though the batteries were dead. It has been years since that climb. I still guide expeditions, but I have never returned to Mount Rainier. Sometimes, late at night, I leave my radio on just for the background noise. Every once in a while, through the hiss of static, I hear it, my own voice calling out names I have tried hard to forget. The mountains had always been my refuge, a place where silence felt like an old friend, rather than something to fear. I had been a ranger for almost a decade, used to long stretches of solitude and unpredictable weather, but that night was different. I had been assigned to drive through a remote pass to check a maintenance station that had gone quiet. My shift was supposed to end before midnight, yet the road wound endlessly upward through dark pines that swallowed the light from my headlights. The only sound was the steady hum of the truck's engine, and the occasional snap of gravel under the tires. About halfway through the pass, the fog appeared. Not rolling in from the valleys like it normally would, it rose, thick and milky, from the ground itself. It was so sudden that I thought I was driving through smoke from a nearby fire. I slowed down, trying to find the yellow lines, but they vanished under the gray blanket. The air outside the window had that cold, heavy stillness that made the world feel suspended. I kept the engine running and leaned forward, squinting at what looked like a faint glow just ahead, but the light moved, sideways, then backward, like it was circling me. I grabbed the radio, trying to call the dispatch office. Static hissed for a few seconds before something else cut through. It was a voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. It said my name. Not once, but several times, each with a different tone. One sounded like it came from a child. Another was deeper, like someone whispering directly into the mic. I thought maybe I'd stumbled into interference from another channel, but when I turned the volume down, the voice grew louder. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was in the air, thin, echoing like it was being carried by the fog itself. The fear didn't hit me all at once. It crept in quietly, the kind that makes you question if your mind is playing tricks. I turned off the engine to listen, and for a few seconds, there was nothing. Just the soft hiss of wind against metal. Then, a tap on the side of the truck. Just one, then another. I spun the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only showed my own breath hanging in the cold. The fog seemed thicker near the trees, pulsing slightly, like it was breathing. I remember gripping the wheel, waiting for something, anything to move, but everything stayed impossibly still. The whispers returned, but this time they came from the passenger side, soft at first, then overlapping like several voices speaking over one another. My own name again, drawn out, almost affectionate. I told myself it had to be the wind. There was no other rational explanation. Still, I could not ignore the way the fog pressed against the glass as if it had weight, forming faint shapes that shifted whenever I blinked. One moment I thought I saw a handprint on the window. The next, it was gone. The fog wasn't moving with the wind. It was moving against it. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I started the truck again and tried reversing, but the tires only spun on the gravel. The headlights were swallowed by the white wall around me. That was when I noticed the clock on the dashboard. It had stopped. The seconds weren't ticking. I tapped the glass, then my wristwatch, but both were frozen at the same time. 12:03. I blinked, checked again. Still 12:03. The air inside the truck had turned icy, every breath forming a small cloud. My radio crackled to life once more, and this time it wasn't just voices. It was breathing, deep, close, and uneven, like someone sitting right behind me. I turned, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The beam cut through the fog-filled cabin, revealing nothing but my own jacket slung over the back seat. I remember whispering, "Who's there?" without even realizing I'd said it aloud. No answer came, but something brushed the edge of the truck bed, a soft scrape, followed by a low knock. 3 times. Each sound landed like it was measured, deliberate. I pressed the horn, half hoping to startle whatever was out there, but it didn't echo back. It was swallowed by the fog as if the air itself had absorbed it. The next thing I remember clearly is the silence that followed. I must have sat there for hours, though it felt like minutes. My eyes kept darting between the windshield and the rearview mirror, even though I could barely see past my own reflection. I thought about stepping out, walking until I found a signal, but something about the fog made that feel like stepping into a dream I wouldn't wake from. The edges of my vision began to blur. I don't know if I passed out or if something else happened, but the next time I opened my eyes, the truck was bathed in pale light. Dawn had come, but not the way it should have. The fog thinned in slow spirals, peeling away like smoke. My hands were stiff on the steering wheel, my neck sore as if I had been sleeping upright for hours. When I stepped out, the air hit me with a strange stillness, heavy with dew. The road behind me was gone. Where the asphalt should have been, there was a cliff, a sheer drop stretching down into mist. My tire marks ended right at the edge. I stood there staring, unable to figure out how I could have driven that far without noticing. The GPS on the dashboard was still blinking, the screen faintly flickering. The coordinates didn't make sense. They placed me in a blank section of terrain, miles from the nearest mapped road. According to the tracker, the truck had been parked there for 7 hours straight. 7 hours that I couldn't account for. My last memory before dawn had been of the fog pressing against the glass, and then nothing. I checked the clock again. It was working now. 7:13. The radio hissed softly with low static, and just beneath it, a voice whispered my name once more, clear as breath against my ear. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, no one believed the story. They said fog banks in the mountains could cause disorientation, that maybe I had fallen asleep from exhaustion, but I knew I hadn't dreamed it. I showed them the GPS data, but when they checked it later, the file was gone, completely wiped. The coordinates I had written down on paper led to nothing but dense forest. The pass itself wasn't even listed on the updated maps anymore, as if it had never existed. I still patrol that region sometimes, though I avoid that route. On certain mornings when the weather turns gray, I hear faint static through my handheld radio, a sound too familiar to ignore. Once I thought I heard my name again, carried by a gust of wind that came from nowhere. I stopped answering after that. Whatever happened in that fog, whatever called to me through it, I am certain of one thing. If I had stepped out of that truck that night, I would not have found my way back. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Widowhood changes you in ways you never expect, and one of those changes was my decision to stay on the property Glenn and I had built together in rural Montana. He passed 2 winters before that night, and somewhere between burying him and turning 43, I convinced myself that staying made sense. Our nearest neighbors, the Farley family, lived about 3 miles down the county road, and the closest sheriff's substation was in Ridgefield, a good 50-minute drive on roads that turned treacherous after dark. People in the city think isolation sounds peaceful, romantic even. But there is nothing romantic about being a woman alone in a house surrounded by wheat fields and darkness that stretches in every direction. That particular night in early November 2017, I had gone to bed around 10, exhausted from splitting firewood and fixing a section of fence the wind had knocked down. My 2 dogs, a German shepherd named Duke and a mutt named Copper, slept in their usual spots by the wood stove. The wind had died down and the house had settled into that deep, consuming quiet that only exists miles away from civilization. I woke to Duke's growl, low and guttural, the kind of sound he only made when something was genuinely wrong. My eyes opened to complete darkness, and for a moment I lay still, listening, trying to separate real sounds from the remnants of whatever dream I had been having. Then Copper joined in, both dogs now at the bedroom window, their bodies rigid, hackles raised in silhouettes against the faint moonlight coming through the curtains. I heard it then, distant but unmistakable, other dogs barking somewhere out in the night. The Farleys had hounds, and they never barked like that unless something had them spooked. I pushed myself up on one elbow, reaching for the lamp on my nightstand, when I saw it, a sweep of headlights moving slowly across my eastern field. Not on the road, but actually in the field, cutting through the harvested wheat stubble. My heart began pounding as I watched the lights move with purpose, methodical, like whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Nobody had any business being on my property at. I checked the clock, 2:47 in the morning. I did not turn on the lamp. Some instinct, ancient and primal, told me to stay in the dark. Instead, I slid out of bed and crouched below the window, peering over the sill just enough to watch. The headlights had stopped moving now, parked at the edge of my property near the old grain silo Glenn had never gotten around to tearing down. Then they went dark. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the dogs growling and the distant sound of the Farley hounds still going wild. Then I saw a second set of headlights appear, coming from the opposite direction, from the west where the old logging road cut through the tree line. These lights also moved slowly, deliberately, and they also stopped at the perimeter of my property before going dark. My mouth went dry. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers finding it in the darkness, and I pressed the power button. The screen lit up and I immediately dimmed it, shielding the glow with my body. No signal. There was never good signal out here, but sometimes I could get 1 bar near the kitchen window. I moved through the house without turning on any lights, Duke and Copper following close behind me, their nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. When I reached the kitchen, I pressed myself against the wall beside the window that faced the front yard and the long gravel driveway that connected my property to the county road. What I saw made my legs go weak. A third vehicle was parked at the end of my driveway, its headlights also off, just a dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. They had surrounded the house. 3 vehicles, positioned at 3 different points, and all of them had known exactly where to stop, exactly how to approach without being seen from the road. I checked my phone again, holding it up near the window, watching desperately for even 1 bar to appear. Nothing. I thought about the landline in the living room, the old rotary phone Glenn had insisted on keeping because cell service was so unreliable. I started moving toward it, staying low, when I heard something that stopped me cold, the distinct sound of a radio crackling somewhere outside, followed by a man's voice too quiet to make out the words, but close enough to hear the tone. I crawled to the living room, my knees scraping against the rug Glenn's mother had given us as a wedding gift. The rotary phone sat on the small table by the couch, and I lifted the receiver as quietly as I could, pressing it to my ear. Dead silence. No dial tone, nothing. They had cut the line. These were not drunk teenagers or lost hunters. These were people who had planned this, who knew that cutting the phone line would leave me stranded, who understood that by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be far too late. I set the receiver down and pressed my back against the couch, trying to think. Glenn's shotgun was in the bedroom closet, a 12-gauge Remington he had taught me to use for coyotes that sometimes went after the chickens. I had not fired it since he died, but I knew it was loaded, knew there was a box of shells on the top shelf beside it. I needed to get back to the bedroom without being seen through any of the windows. Duke suddenly let out a sharp bark, and I grabbed his collar, pulling him close, whispering for him to be quiet. Through the living room window, I saw a beam of light sweep across the front porch. A flashlight. Someone was on my porch, right outside the front door, maybe 15 feet from where I was crouched in the darkness. I heard footsteps on the wooden boards, slow and deliberate, and then the light paused at the window. I pressed myself flat against the floor, my cheek against the cold hardwood, holding both dogs by their collars as they trembled and growled. The beam moved across the room above me, illuminating the couch, the bookshelf, the fireplace mantel with our wedding photo still displayed. Then the light clicked off, and I heard the footsteps retreat, followed by that radio crackle again. A different voice this time, deeper, responded with something I could not understand. They were communicating positions, coordinating movements, and they were doing it with the kind of calm efficiency that terrified me more than anything else. I waited until the footsteps faded before I started crawling toward the hallway that led back to the bedroom. Every creak of the floorboard sounded impossibly loud, and I kept expecting a window to shatter or a door to burst open at any moment. When I finally reached the bedroom, I eased the closet door open and felt around in the darkness until my fingers closed around the cold steel of the shotgun barrel. I pulled it out, checked that it was loaded by touch alone, and grabbed the box of shells from the top shelf. My hands were unsteady as I shoved extra shells into the pockets of my pajama pants. I had no plan beyond this, no idea what I was supposed to do against multiple armed men who clearly knew what they were doing. I thought about hiding, about crawling into the space beneath the bed or locking myself in the bathroom, but I knew that would only delay whatever was coming. These people had not gone through all this trouble just to leave empty-handed. They wanted something, and the only thing of value in this house was me. A sound from the back of the house made Duke lunge forward, barking furiously, and this time I could not stop him. He bolted down the hallway toward the kitchen, Copper right behind him, and I heard the back door rattle violently in its frame. Someone was trying to force it open. I ran after the dogs, the shotgun raised, my bare feet slapping against the floor. When I reached the kitchen, I saw the door shaking as someone threw their weight against it from outside. The deadbolt was holding, but the door was old, the wood frame soft from decades of Montana winters. It would not hold for long. I aimed the shotgun at the center of the door and screamed at the top of my lungs that I had a gun, that I would shoot anyone who came through. The pounding stopped. For a moment there was silence, and I heard that radio crackle again, followed by a voice I will never forget as long as I live. It was calm, almost amused, and it said clearly enough for me to hear through the door. "She is in the kitchen, armed, 12 gauge, probably the husband's old Remington." They knew about Glenn. They knew about the gun. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I almost doubled over. These were not strangers who had randomly chosen my house. These were people who had watched me, studied me, learned my routines and my vulnerabilities. I thought about all the times I had gone into town for groceries, all the conversations I had at the feed store or the gas station, mentioning that I lived alone now, that Glenn was gone, that the property was too big for one person, but I could not bring myself to sell. I had told strangers my entire situation without ever thinking twice. The voice outside spoke again, this time directed at me. "Mrs. Hartley, we know you are alone. We know the nearest deputy is 47 minutes away on a good night, and the roads are icy. We know your cell phone does not work out here. We have done this before, and it always goes easier when people cooperate." The casual way he listed these facts, like he was reading from a checklist, made me realize how carefully they had planned everything. They had probably watched the house for weeks, maybe months, noting when I went to bed, when I woke up, which lights I turned on and when I turned them off. I backed away from the door, the shotgun still raised, my mind racing through options that all seemed hopeless. The windows were old single-pane glass, easy to break. The doors were solid, but the frames were weak. Even if I shot one of them, there were others, and they would be through the house before I could reload. Then I remembered something, the root cellar. Glenn had dug it himself the second year we lived here, an underground space beneath the kitchen accessible through a trap door hidden under the rug by the pantry. He had installed a heavy steel door at the bottom of the stairs, paranoid about tornadoes even though they were rare this far north. The cellar had supplies, canned food, water, a battery-powered radio, and most importantly, it had a lock that could only be opened from the inside. If I could get down there with the dogs, I could wait them out. Eventually, someone would notice I was missing. Eventually, help would come. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan I had, and I was running out of time. I moved quickly, pulling back the rug with one hand while keeping the shotgun ready with the other. The trapdoor was right where it had always been, the iron ring handle cold against my palm. I yanked it open and whistled for the dogs, and Duke understood immediately, bounding down the wooden stairs into the darkness below. Copper hesitated, confused, and I had to grab him by the collar and practically shove him through the opening. I was halfway down the stairs myself when I heard glass shatter somewhere in the house, followed by heavy footsteps and voices calling out to each other. They were inside. I pulled the trapdoor shut above me, fumbling in the darkness for the steel door at the bottom of the stairs. My fingers found the handle, and I pulled it closed just as I heard footsteps in the kitchen directly above me. The lock was a heavy deadbolt, the kind you would find on a commercial door, and it slid into place with a solid thunk that echoed in the small concrete room. I pressed my back against the cold wall, both dogs huddled against my legs, and I listened to the sounds of my home being torn apart above me, cabinets slamming, furniture being overturned, and then footsteps directly over the trapdoor, followed by the sound of someone pulling at the handle. A voice, the same calm voice from before, called down through the floor. "Mrs. Hartley, that is a very old door. We have tools, we have time. The choice is yours." I did not answer. I sat in the darkness with my shotgun aimed at the steel door. My dogs pressed against me, and I waited. I heard drilling, prying, the sound of metal scraping against metal. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Then, suddenly it stopped. I heard voices arguing, urgent now, the calm tone gone. A vehicle engine started somewhere outside, then another. Through the concrete walls, I heard tires on gravel moving fast, moving away. I did not move from that cellar until sunlight began to creep through the small ventilation grate near the ceiling. When I finally climbed out, my house was destroyed. Every drawer emptied, every closet ransacked, furniture overturned and broken. But I was alive. The sheriff found me sitting on my front porch with the shotgun across my lap, and I told him everything. He listened with the expression I could not read, then told me there had been 3 other home invasions in the county over the past 2 years, all isolated properties, all women living alone. 2 of those women were never seen again. They never caught the men who did it. I sold the property 6 weeks later and moved to Bozeman, where I can see my neighbors' houses from my kitchen window. I still do not sleep through the night. I still wake up at 2:47 in the morning, listening for dogs barking in the distance, waiting for headlights to sweep across a field that no longer exists outside my window. Ridgefield, Montana is the kind of place that does not show up on most maps. Population 200 and something, depending on who had moved away or passed on that year. My best friend Haley and I were sent there every summer to stay with my grandparents while our parents worked. And by the time we finished 6th grade, we knew that dirt road to Perkins General Store better than we knew our own backyards. 4 miles of packed earth cutting through wheat fields and abandoned farmland, with nothing but fence posts and the occasional rusted tractor to break up the endless gold horizon. We had walked it dozens of times without incident, 2 12-year-old girls with too much energy and not enough supervision, picking wild blackberries and racing each other to the old Jennings barn that sat rotting at the halfway point. Our grandparents never worried about us making that trip alone, because nothing ever happened in Ridgefield. That was the whole point of the place, the safety of isolation, the comfort of knowing every single face in town. On that Thursday morning in early June, Grandma pressed a $20 bill into my palm and handed me her grocery list, and Haley and I set off like we had 100 times before. The heat hit us the moment we stepped off the porch, that dry Montana summer heat that makes the air shimmer above the road like a mirage. Haley complained about the dust getting into her sandals, and I told her she should have worn sneakers like I did, and we bickered about nothing as we walked. We were roughly 2 miles in when I heard the engine approaching from behind, which meant nothing at first because farmers drove that road constantly. But this vehicle slowed down in a way that made me turn around and look. A dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper and mud splattered across the wheel wells pulled up alongside us, keeping pace with our walking speed. The driver leaned across the passenger seat and rolled down the window, and I got my first clear look at his face. He had thin blonde hair slicked back against his scalp with something greasy, pale blue eyes that seemed too wide for his face, and a smile that stretched his lips in a way that showed every single one of his yellow teeth. When he spoke, his voice came out warm and friendly, the kind of voice adults use when they want children to trust them immediately. "You girls must be the Whitaker grandkids," he said, nodding like he already knew the answer. "Heading to Perkins, I bet. Your grandma send you for groceries?" I remember feeling a small wave of relief at that moment, because he knew our family name, which meant he had to be a local, someone safe. Haley relaxed a little beside me too, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. The man kept talking, explaining that he worked on one of the farms further out past the county line and came through Ridgefield every few weeks for supplies. He said his name was Gene, or maybe it was Dean, something short and plain that I cannot remember clearly anymore because everything that came after erased those small details from my mind. What I do remember is what he said next, leaning further toward the open window with that strange wide smile still plastered across his face. He told us there had been coyote attacks on the road up ahead, that a pack had gotten bold and gone after a couple of dogs just yesterday, and it was not safe for 2 young girls to be walking alone. Haley looked at me with uncertainty in her eyes, and I could tell she was trying to decide whether to believe him. The thing was, coyote problems were not unusual in that area, and we had been warned about them before by our grandfather, who kept a rifle by the back door for that exact reason. So the story made sense, and the man seemed to know that it would. He offered us a ride the rest of the way to the store, saying it would only take a few minutes, and he was heading that direction anyway. I hesitated, feeling something heavy settle in my chest that I could not explain, a reluctance that had no logical source. But Haley was already moving toward the truck, and I did not want to seem like a scared little kid in front of her. I climbed into the cab after her, settling onto the cracked leather bench seat that smelled like cigarettes and something else, something sour and faintly chemical that I could not identify. The man pulled back onto the road, and for a minute everything seemed normal. Just the rumble of the engine and the dust billowing behind us through the rear window. Then I noticed we were not going the right way. The road to Perkins continued straight for another 2 miles before curving slightly east toward the village center. But this man had turned left onto a narrow side path that led into the overgrown Jennings property. I knew that land well because Haley and I had explored the edges of it many times, daring each other to get closer to the collapsing barn with its dark windows that looked like empty eye sockets. The truck bounced over ruts and potholes as the main road disappeared behind a wall of tall wild grass, and my heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. I asked him where we were going, trying to keep my voice steady, and he said this was a shortcut that would get us to the store faster. But that was a lie, and I knew it was a lie, because this road led nowhere except deeper into abandoned farmland. Haley grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight, her palm slick with sweat. I looked at her face and saw my own fear reflected back at me, her eyes wide and her lips pressed together in a thin line. The man kept talking in that same cheerful tone, telling us about the weather and the wheat harvest and other things that meant nothing, filling the air with words so we would not have time to think. But I was thinking, and what I was thinking was that nobody knew where we were. Our grandparents expected us to be gone for at least 2 hours, and if we disappeared into these fields, no one would even start looking for us until lunchtime. The truck slowed down as we approached the old Jennings barn, and I saw that someone had been here recently because there were fresh tire tracks in the mud, and the padlock on the barn door had been replaced with a shiny new one. The man pulled the truck to a stop and turned off the engine, and in that sudden silence I could hear birds singing somewhere far away and the tick of the cooling motor. He turned to look at us with that same terrible smile, and he said we should wait here for just a minute while he checked on something inside the barn. That was when Haley screamed. It was not a word or a call for help, just a raw animal sound of pure terror that seemed to unlock something in both of us. She yanked the door handle and threw herself out of the truck before I even understood what was happening, and I followed her a half-second later, my feet hitting the ground hard enough to send a jolt of pain up through my ankles. The man shouted something behind us, his friendly voice gone sharp and ugly, but I did not turn around to see if he was chasing us. We ran into the tall grass, pushing through stalks that whipped against our faces and arms, our breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Haley somewhere to my left, crashing through the vegetation, and I angled toward the sound of her footsteps. The grass was so high that I could not see more than a few feet in any direction, and I kept expecting to feel a hand close around my arm or my hair at any moment. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I did not slow down, could not slow down, because somewhere behind us was a man who had taken us to an abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere, and I knew with absolute certainty what that meant. We ran until the grass thinned out and gave way to a plowed field, the dirt soft and uneven beneath our feet. I stumbled twice and caught myself with my hands, scraping my palms raw against rocks and dry clods of earth. Haley was crying now, loud hiccuping sobs that she could not control, and I grabbed her wrist and pulled her along because we could not stop yet. In the distance, I could see a farmhouse with a red roof and a weather vane shaped like a rooster, and I pointed toward it and told Haley to keep going. My whole body was shaking, not just my hands but my legs and my jaw and something deep inside my chest that would not stop trembling no matter how hard I tried to control it. We crossed what felt like miles of open field, exposed and vulnerable under that bright blue sky, before we finally reached the farmhouse and I started pounding on the door with both fists. A woman in her 60s opened it, flour on her apron and confusion on her face, and I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and desperate, and I could see that she did not understand. Her name was Loretta Grimes, and she sat us down at her kitchen table and gave us glasses of water while she called our grandparents. Haley could not stop crying, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. And I held her hand across the table while I tried to answer Loretta's questions. I told her about the man in the green truck, about the lie he told us about coyotes, about the turn onto the side road and the barn with the new padlock. Loretta's face went pale as I spoke, and she picked up the phone again to call the sheriff's office in the next town over. My grandfather arrived 20 minutes later, his face a mask of fear and fury that I had never seen before, and he wrapped both of us in his arms so tight I could barely breathe. The sheriff's deputy showed up an hour after that, a young man with a notepad who wrote down everything I said and nodded seriously but did not seem particularly alarmed. He told us the description matched several trucks in the county and that without a license plate number, there was not much they could do. My grandmother kept saying we should never have been walking alone, that it was her fault for sending us, and the guilt in her voice made me feel worse than anything else that had happened that day. The following weeks were strange and uncomfortable in ways I did not expect. Word spread through Ridgefield quickly, as it does in small towns, but the reaction was not what I thought it would be. Some people believed us completely and praised us for being smart enough to run. But others, including people I had known my whole life, suggested that we had misunderstood the situation. Maybe the man really was just trying to help, they said. Maybe we panicked for no reason and made a nice farmer look like a criminal. One older man at the general store told my grandfather that city kids were always too suspicious, too dramatic, and that we probably scared a good Samaritan half to death by jumping out of his truck like that. The doubt hurt almost as much as the memory of that day, and Haley and I stopped talking about what happened because it seemed like nobody wanted to hear it. We finished out the summer at our grandparents' house, but we never walked to the store alone again. And we never explored the old Jennings property, and we slept in the same bed every night because neither of us could stand to be alone in the dark. 6 weeks after that Thursday morning, my mother called with news that made her voice crack and tremble through the phone line. A man had been arrested in Carroll County, about 80 miles south of Ridgefield, after attempting to force a 9-year-old boy into his vehicle outside a gas station. The boy's father had been inside paying and came out just in time to see what was happening, and he held the man down until police arrived. The vehicle was a dark green pickup truck with a dented front bumper. When investigators searched the property where the man lived, a rented trailer on the edge of an old farming community, they found things that my mother would not describe to me no matter how many times I asked. She only said that the man had done this before, in other counties, in other states, and that some of those children had never been found. I sat on the edge of my bed in my childhood room, the phone pressed against my ear, and I thought about that barn with the shiny new padlock and the fresh tire tracks in the mud. I thought about how close we had come to being part of a story that ended very differently. A story that might have ended with our photographs on missing person flyers stapled to telephone poles across Montana. Haley and I are adults now, both of us with families of our own, and we have only talked about that day a handful of times in all the years since. But I think about it more often than I would like to admit, usually when I see my own daughter walking home from school or riding her bike around the neighborhood. I taught her early about strangers and cars and the lies that dangerous people tell, and I made sure she understood that politeness is never more important than survival. She knows that if something feels wrong, she should run first and explain later, and she knows that I will always believe her no matter what anyone else says. The man who drove that green truck is serving multiple life sentences now, locked away in a place where he cannot hurt anyone else. But sometimes late at night when sleep will not come, I still see his face through that rolled-down window. I still see those yellow teeth stretched into that wide, unnatural smile. And I still hear his friendly voice, asking if we were the Whitaker grandkids heading to the store. And I wonder how many other children heard that same voice, saw that same smile, and were not lucky enough or fast enough to escape into the tall grass before it was too late. My cousin got me the job at the grain facility out near Harlow County, about 40 minutes from the nearest town with a stoplight. He worked for the agricultural company that owned the place and said they needed someone to cover night shifts for a few weeks, while their regular guy recovered from back surgery. Simple work, he promised. Walk the perimeter twice a night, log any delivery trucks that came through, check the temperature gauges on the storage bays, and make sure nobody was messing around on the property. The pay was decent for what amounted to sitting in a small office trailer and reading most of the night. I had just finished my teaching certification and was waiting for the school district to finalize my contract for the fall semester, so the timing worked out. My girlfriend thought I was crazy for taking a job in the middle of nowhere, but we needed the money, and 6 weeks of overnight shifts seemed like easy cash. The facility itself sat on about 15 acres of flat land surrounded by cornfields on 3 sides and a county road on the 4th. There were 6 massive grain silos, a long metal warehouse for equipment storage, and 3 smaller storage bays used for overflow during harvest season. The office trailer where I spent most of my time was positioned near the front gate, close enough to the road that I could see headlights coming from a mile away. My first 3 shifts were exactly what my cousin described. Boring in the best way possible. I did my rounds at midnight and again at 4 in the morning, wrote down a whole lot of nothing in the logbook, and spent the rest of my time grading practice tests I had created for the class I would be teaching in September. The only company I had was the security cameras, 8 of them total, feeding grainy black and white footage to a monitor that looked like it belonged in the 90s. The night sounds out there took some getting used to. The grain settling in the silos made these deep groaning noises, and the wind coming across the fields would rattle the metal siding on the warehouse something fierce. It was my 4th shift when I noticed the first thing that seemed wrong. During my midnight round, I walked past Storage Bay 2, one of the smaller units used for equipment and spare parts, and saw fresh tire tracks in the gravel leading up to the roll-up door. Now that door was supposed to stay locked, and according to the schedule my cousin had given me, no deliveries were expected until the following Tuesday. I checked the lock and it was secure, so I figured maybe someone from the day crew had pulled up there earlier and I just had not noticed the tracks before. I wrote it down in the logbook anyway, the way I was supposed to, and finished my round without thinking much more about it. But when I came back around at 4 in the morning, I noticed something else. There was a dark stain on the concrete pad right outside the bay door, maybe 2 feet wide, like someone had spilled something and tried to wash it away. The edges were still wet. I crouched down and touched it, and my fingers came up with this faint pinkish color. Looked diluted, like whatever it was had been hosed down but not completely cleaned. I stood there for a while trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. Maybe one of the day workers had cut himself and cleaned it up. Maybe someone hit a deer on the road and pulled in to check their vehicle. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, but something kept nagging at me. Why would anyone wash down a spill at a grain facility in the middle of the night? I took a few pictures with my phone, just in case, and went back to the trailer. I thought about calling my cousin, but it was almost 5 in the morning and I did not want to wake him up over what was probably nothing. The rest of that shift, I kept looking at those pictures, zooming in like I was going to find some answer hidden in the pixels. When the day supervisor showed up at 6 to relieve me, I mentioned the tire tracks and the stain. He was this older guy named Dwight, been working there for 15 years, and he just shrugged and said it was probably hydraulic fluid from one of the tractors. He did not seem concerned at all, so I let it go, but I saved those pictures anyway. 2 nights later, I found the tools. I was doing my 4 in the morning round, walking along the back side of the warehouse where the security cameras did not reach. There was a dead zone back there, maybe 60 feet of space between the building and the fence line that nobody had bothered to cover. I almost tripped over a canvas bag sitting in the weeds near the drainage ditch. It was heavy, and when I opened it, I found a set of bolt cutters, a crowbar, a roll of duct tape, and a box of latex gloves. None of it belonged to the facility. I knew every piece of equipment in that warehouse because I had walked through it during my orientation, and this stuff was not on any inventory list. The bolt cutters still had price tags on them from a hardware store I did not recognize. I stood there holding that bag, my heart going a mile a minute, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some random stuff that blew in or got dumped by kids messing around. But bolt cutters and duct tape do not just appear together by accident. I put everything back exactly how I found it, marked the spot in my head, and walked back to the trailer as fast as I could without running. I called my cousin that morning after my shift ended. Told him everything, the tire tracks, the stain, the bag of tools. He got quiet for a long time, which was not like him at all. Finally, he said I should keep my head down and not mention any of this to Dwight or anyone else at the facility. He said he would make some calls and figure out what was going on, but in the meantime, I should just do my job and stay in the trailer as much as possible. That advice did not sit right with me. I asked him what he thought was happening, and he just said some of the storage bays got leased out to third parties, and he did not always know what they were being used for. The way he said it made me feel like he knew more than he was telling me. I barely slept that day. I lay in bed at my apartment staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. Drug storage maybe, stolen merchandise. I even thought about human trafficking. But that seemed too extreme, too much like something from a documentary. By the time I drove back out to the facility that evening for my next shift, I had almost talked myself into quitting. But I needed that money, and I kept telling myself I was probably overreacting to a bunch of coincidences. That night changed everything. I got to the facility around 9, same as always, and Dwight handed off the keys without much conversation. He seemed tired, distracted, and he left quicker than usual. I settled into the trailer, made some coffee, and started going through my lesson plans. Around 11, I noticed headlights on the security monitor, a truck coming down the access road from the back of the property, not from the main county road where deliveries usually came. That road was supposed to be gated and locked, only used during harvest season when they needed extra access for the big equipment. I watched the truck pull around behind Storage Bay 2, the same bay where I had found the tire tracks. It sat there for about 10 minutes with its lights off, and then it left the same way it came. No one got out that I could see. No one approached the trailer or checked in with me. According to every protocol I had been given, any vehicle on the property at night was supposed to log in with the night watchman. That was literally my entire job. I wrote down the time and a description of the truck, white full-size pickup, no visible plates from the camera angle, and I sat there wondering if I should go check the bay or just pretend I had not seen anything. I waited about an hour before I worked up the nerve to walk out there. The night was warm and still, no wind for once, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I took my flashlight and walked the long way around, staying close to the silos where I could duck out of sight if I needed to. When I got to Storage Bay 2, I noticed the padlock was different. The old one had been brass, weathered and scratched up from years of use. This one was silver, brand new, with a black rubber coating around the shackle. Someone had changed the lock. I put my ear against the roll-up door. I know that sounds stupid, like something from a movie, but I did not know what else to do. And I heard nothing at first, just the metal ticking as it cooled down from the day's heat. Then I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. Voices, muffled, impossible to make out the words, but definitely human voices coming from inside the bay. And then a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. A short, sharp cry, cut off almost immediately like someone had been hurt, and then silenced. I backed away from that door so fast I almost fell over my own feet. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just heard, trying to convince myself it was something else. An animal, a radio, anything but what it sounded like. I made it back to the trailer in what felt like seconds, locked the door behind me, and sat there staring at the security monitors with my phone in my hand. I should have called the police right then. I know that now. But I kept thinking about what my cousin had said, about keeping my head down, about how some of the bays were leased to third parties. What if I was wrong? What if I called the cops and it turned out to be nothing? And I lost my job and my cousin lost his job, and I looked like a paranoid idiot. I sat there for 20 minutes, maybe longer, arguing with myself. And then I saw movement on the monitor. Someone was walking toward the trailer, A man tall, wearing dark clothes, coming from the direction of Storage Bay 2. He was not rushing, not trying to hide. He walked like someone who belonged there, like someone who had every right to be on that property in the middle of the night. I watched him get closer and closer until he walked right out of the camera's frame, and then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside the trailer door. He knocked 3 times, slow and deliberate. I did not answer. I did not move. I barely breathed. Through the small window next to the door, I could see the outline of his shape, just standing there, waiting. Then he spoke, and his voice was calm, almost friendly. He said he knew I was in there and that we needed to have a conversation about what I had seen over the past few nights. He said it in a way that made it clear he already knew everything. The pictures I took, the bag of tools I found, the fact that I had been asking questions. He said I seemed like a smart guy, and smart guys understood when it was better to look the other way. He said some people made good money just by not seeing things, and that could be me if I wanted it to be. He never raised his voice, never made an explicit threat. He did not have to. The implication was clear enough. I sat there in the dark, my phone still in my hand, and I did not say a single word. After what felt like forever, he knocked once more, just once, and then the footsteps moved away. I watched on the monitor as he walked back toward the storage bay, got into a dark SUV I had not noticed before, and drove off using that back access road. I did not finish that shift. The second his taillights disappeared from the camera, I grabbed my keys and walked straight to my car. I did not clock out, did not leave a note, did not call anyone. I just drove. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, and I kept checking the rearview mirror the entire 40 minutes back to town. I called my cousin the next morning and told him I was done, that I was not going back to that facility ever again. He did not argue. He did not ask questions, he just said he understood, and that he would take care of it with the company. A week later, I saw on the local news that there had been a fire at an agricultural storage facility in Harlow County. Electrical malfunction, they said. Storage Bay 2 was completely destroyed. No injuries reported, no investigation opened. The facility shut down for repairs and never reopened. My cousin stopped returning my calls after that. We have not spoken in almost 2 years now, and when I see him at family gatherings, he acts like nothing ever happened. Like those 6 weeks just got erased from both our memories. I never found out what was really going on in that storage bay. I never found out who that man was or what happened to whoever made that sound I heard through the door. Some nights I still think about it. Lying awake at 3 in the morning, running through everything I should have done differently. I should have called the police that first night when I found the stain. I should have trusted my gut instead of listening to my cousin. I should have done something instead of just running away, but I did not, and now I have to live with that. The teaching job came through a few weeks after everything happened, and I threw myself into work, tried to move on, tried to convince myself that whatever was happening at that facility was not my problem anymore. But every now and then, I will be driving at night and I will pass some industrial building sitting alone in the dark, lights off, nothing moving, and I will feel this cold twist in my chest. Because I know now that there are places like that everywhere. Places where things happen that nobody talks about, and there are people whose job it is to make sure nobody ever finds out. I was almost one of those people. Sometimes I wonder if the only reason I am still here, still able to tell this story, is because I was smart enough to stay quiet and scared enough to run. And I do not know which part of that bothers me more. Rural Kansas has a way of making you feel both free and completely exposed at the same time. When my dad passed in 2017, he left me 47 acres of farmland that had been in our family since my great-grandfather bought it dirt cheap during the Depression. My wife Sheila and I had been renting a cramped apartment in Denver for 6 years by then, and with our twin daughters about to start kindergarten, the timing felt right. We moved in that September, right around my high school reunion, which made me realize how much time had slipped by since I left that small town as a kid, dreaming of city life. The property sat at the end of a long dirt road, almost a mile from the county route, surrounded by nothing but wheat fields and a few scattered oak trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The previous tenant, a guy named Jerry Mullins who helped my dad maintain the place after his stroke, had moved out 3 months before we arrived. The house needed work, but it was ours, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I could breathe. The trouble started in late October, maybe 6 weeks after we settled in. We had been dealing with the usual rural annoyances: hunters cutting across the back acres without permission, teenagers using the empty barn for weekend parties, that kind of thing. Sheila found beer cans and cigarette butts near the old grain silo one morning, and that was the final straw for her. She wanted a gate, something solid with a good lock, to keep people from just driving onto our land whenever they felt like it. I agreed, mostly to ease her mind, and spent a whole Saturday installing a heavy steel gate at the entrance where our dirt road met the county route. I bought a thick padlock from the hardware store in town, one of those hardened steel ones that cost almost $40. We each kept a key, and I hid a spare inside the hollow fence post nearby, just in case. That first night with the gate locked, I remember Sheila squeezing my hand at dinner and saying she finally felt safe out here. I believed her when she said it, and I believed it myself. 3 days later, I woke up around 5 in the morning to let the dog out and noticed the gate was wide open. Not broken, not forced, just open, swinging gently in the November wind like someone had casually unlocked it and forgotten to close it behind them. I walked the whole length of that dirt road in my bathrobe and boots, flashlight in hand, looking for any sign of what happened. Nothing. No trash, no footprints that I could make out in the dark, no indication that anyone had even been there. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it properly, even though I could picture myself clicking that padlock shut and tugging it twice to make sure. Sheila gave me a look when I came back inside, the kind of look that said she was trusting me to keep us safe out here. I promised her it would not happen again, and I meant it. That evening, I checked the lock 3 separate times before coming inside for dinner, but it did happen again. The following Monday morning, Sheila was the one who found it. Gate wide open, padlock hanging loose on the chain like it had been gently placed there by someone with all the time in the world. This time I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, deep grooves from a heavy vehicle that had driven right up our road sometime during the night. I followed those tracks almost halfway to the house before they curved off toward the old barn and disappeared into the harder ground near the equipment shed. I searched that barn top to bottom, checked every stall, climbed up into the hayloft where dust hung thick in the morning light. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but someone had definitely been on our property. Someone with a key. I called the sheriff that afternoon, and Deputy Nolan came out to take a report, but he seemed almost bored by the whole thing. "Probably just kids," he said. "Probably someone messing with you." I wanted to believe him, but those tire tracks told a different story. I replaced the lock that same week, drove 30 miles to a different hardware store because I did not want to buy from the same place, thinking maybe somehow someone had gotten a duplicate made. This new padlock was even heavier, a different brand with keys that had a unique pattern cut into them. I threw away the old lock entirely and made sure only Sheila and I had copies this time. No spare hidden in the fence post, nothing. For about 10 days, everything seemed normal. The gate stayed locked, the road stayed empty, and I started to convince myself that Deputy Nolan had been right after all. Maybe it really was just some kids playing a prank, and once they realized we were serious about security, they moved on to easier targets. Sheila stopped checking the windows every night before bed. The girls started playing outside again without one of us hovering nearby. I let my guard down, and that was exactly when things got worse. It was a Saturday morning in mid-November when I walked out to check the gate and found something that made me stop dead in the middle of the road. The gate was locked, completely secure, chain wrapped tight, padlock clicked shut just like I had left it. But it was not my padlock. The one hanging there was silver instead of black, a completely different brand, with a keyhole that my keys would never fit. Someone had come onto our property during the night, removed my lock entirely, and replaced it with their own. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This was not a prank. This was not teenagers looking for a place to drink beer. Whoever was doing this wanted me to know they could come and go whenever they pleased, that no lock I bought would keep them out. They were sending a message, and the message was clear. This property belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. I cut that lock off with bolt cutters and bought a third one that afternoon, but my hands were unsteady the whole drive home. Sheila wanted to move. She said it plainly over dinner that night, the girls already in bed, her voice low and controlled in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. She said she did not feel safe anymore, that whoever was doing this knew too much about our routines, about when we were asleep, about how to get in without leaving a trace. I tried to calm her down, told her we would figure it out. But the truth was I did not have answers. I called Deputy Nolan again the next morning, and he came out to look at the new lock I had cut off, turning it over in his hands like it was a curiosity rather than evidence. He said there was not much he could do without catching someone in the act. No crime had technically been committed, no theft, no property damage beyond the locks themselves. He suggested we install cameras, maybe motion lights, something to discourage whoever was doing this. It felt like being told to solve my own problem, but I did not know what else to do. That night I ordered 2 trail cameras online, the kind hunters use to photograph deer, and paid extra for overnight shipping. The cameras arrived on a Wednesday, and I spent most of that afternoon mounting them. One pointed directly at the gate, hidden inside a wooden birdhouse I nailed to a tree about 20 feet back, and another aimed at the dirt road from the corner of our front porch. They were motion-activated, designed to capture clear images even in total darkness using infrared. I tested them a dozen times, walking back and forth in front of each one until I was satisfied they were working perfectly. Sheila watched me from the kitchen window the whole time, and when I came inside she hugged me longer than usual. We both knew that whatever those cameras captured might change everything. That night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour to see if the motion alerts had triggered. Nothing happened. The next night was the same, quiet, still. The gate locked tight every morning when I walked out to check. By Friday I started to wonder if maybe the cameras themselves had scared whoever it was away. If just knowing they were being watched was enough to make them stop. I should have known better than to hope for something that simple. Saturday morning I woke up to 3 motion alerts on my phone, all time-stamped between 2 and 3 in the morning. My mouth went dry before I even opened the app. The first image showed headlights approaching the gate from the county route, just 2 bright circles floating in the darkness. The second image was clearer. A pickup truck, dark-colored, maybe blue or green, parked right in front of the gate with its engine still running. I could see exhaust rising in the cold air, caught by the infrared flash. The third image is the one that made me sit down on the edge of the bed and stay there for a long time. A man stood at the gate, his back to the camera, wearing a heavy work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He was not cutting the lock. He was not forcing anything. He had a key in his hand, and he was unlocking my gate the same way I did every single day, with the easy confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before. The camera caught him mid-motion, his arm extended, the lock already open in his other hand. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged there. I showed Sheila the photos and watched her face go pale. She asked me if I recognized the truck, and I told her I did not. But something about it nagged at me. The shape of it, the way the tailgate sat slightly crooked like it had been bent in an accident years ago. I spent the next hour going through every image the cameras had captured, frame by frame, looking for anything that might help identify this person. The camera near the house had triggered too, showing the same truck driving slowly up our road, headlights off now, moving like a shadow through the darkness toward the barn. There were 6 images total of the vehicle parked behind the equipment shed, sitting there for almost 40 minutes before it turned around and left the same way it came. 40 minutes. This person had been on our property for 40 minutes while my wife and daughters slept in their beds, while I lay dreaming not 200 yards away. I called Deputy Nolan again, and this time he actually sounded interested. He asked me to email him the photos, said he would run the truck through some databases, see if anything came up. But I was done waiting for the sheriff to solve this. I needed to find out who this was myself. The next morning I drove into town and stopped at the diner where most of the old-timers gathered for breakfast. I figured if anyone knew about a dark pickup truck with a crooked tailgate, it would be someone who had lived in this county their whole life. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee, then started asking questions as casually as I could. Mentioned I was looking for someone who might do some work on my property, someone who knew the area well. A woman named Betty who worked the register overheard me and asked which property I was talking about. When I told her, she got quiet for a second before saying I should talk to Jerry Mullins. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. Jerry Mullins, the same man who had worked for my father, who had lived on our property as a caretaker for almost 3 years before we moved in. Betty said Jerry had a dark green Ford pickup, older model, with a dented tailgate from when he backed into a fence post years ago. She said he still lived about 15 miles north, in a trailer near the creek, and that he had been having money troubles ever since my father let him go. I did not correct her. My father never let Jerry go. Jerry had simply stopped showing up after my dad got too sick to manage the property anymore. I thanked Betty, left a $10 bill on the counter, and drove straight to the address she gave me. I found Jerry Mullins sitting on a plastic chair outside his trailer, smoking a cigarette and watching the road like he had been expecting someone. The truck was parked right there beside him. Dark green, crooked tailgate, the same vehicle from my camera footage. He did not seem surprised to see me. He did not even stand up when I got out of my car and walked toward him. I asked him straight out if he had been coming onto my property at night, and he just took a long drag of his cigarette before nodding slowly, like I had asked him about the weather. He said he still had keys. He said my father had given him copies years ago, back when he was trusted to come and go as he pleased, and he had never seen a reason to give them back. When I asked him why, what he was doing out there in the middle of the night, he looked at me with something that might have been shame or might have been defiance. I still cannot tell which. He said he had been storing things in the barn. Equipment, tools, some furniture he could not fit in his trailer. He said he figured no one was using the space anyway, and he did not think it would matter. 3 years of my father being sick, then dead, and Jerry had just kept coming and going like the property was still his responsibility. Like nothing had changed at all. I wanted to be angry. Part of me wanted to grab him by his jacket and demand to know what gave him the right. What made him think he could terrorize my family like that? Make my wife afraid to sleep in her own home. But looking at him sitting there in that plastic chair, his clothes worn thin, his trailer rusting at the edges, I mostly just felt tired. I told him to give me the keys, all of them, every copy he had ever made. He went inside without a word and came back with a small metal ring holding 4 different keys, each one labeled with faded tape that had my father's handwriting on it. Front gate, barn door, equipment shed, back entrance. He handed them over and I stood there holding them, feeling the weight of all those years my father had trusted this man. I asked Jerry if he understood that he could not come back, that this was over now. He nodded and stubbed out his cigarette on the arm of his chair. He said he was sorry, that he never meant to scare anyone, that he always came late at night specifically so he would not bother us. Like that made it better. Like the intent behind the fear somehow erased the fear itself. I drove home and told Sheila everything. We searched the barn together that afternoon and found exactly what Jerry had described. Boxes of old tools, a broken generator, some water-damaged furniture stacked in the corner of the hayloft. Nothing sinister, nothing dangerous, just the sad remnants of a man who could not let go of a place that was no longer his. I changed every lock on the property that weekend, installed new deadbolts, and added 2 more cameras just to be safe. Deputy Nolan closed the case without filing charges after I told him I did not want to press the issue. Jerry was pathetic more than criminal, and dragging him through the courts would not undo the weeks of fear we had already lived through. Sheila still checks the gate every morning before I wake up. Sometimes I catch her standing at the window late at night, watching the road, waiting for headlights that I pray will never come again. We talk about selling the place sometimes, starting over somewhere else, but this land belonged to my family for almost a century, and I'm not ready to let one troubled man take that from us. The locks are changed, the cameras are watching, and Jerry Mullins has not come back. But I still keep those 4 keys he gave me, tucked in a drawer beside my bed, where I can look at them whenever I need to remind myself that the thing I feared most was not a monster or a ghost. It was just a man with a key and nowhere else to go. Buying a house on 12 acres outside Charlottesville, Virginia was supposed to be the best decision of my life. I had spent my 20s bouncing between cramped apartments in Richmond, sharing walls with people who screamed at each other at all hours, and when my grandmother passed and left me enough for a down payment, I did not hesitate. The farmhouse was old, built in the 1940s according to the county records, with a sagging porch, outdated kitchen cabinets, and a well pump that groaned every morning like it was in pain. But it sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by woods on 3 sides, and for the first time in my adult life, I could not hear a single neighbor. I worked from home as a medical transcriptionist, typing up doctor notes in my pajamas, so the isolation suited me perfectly. My closest neighbor was Harold Jennings, an 80-something widower who lived about a mile down the road. We had a deal where I checked on him twice a week and he kept an eye on my property when I was away. By June, I had been living there for 8 months, and I finally felt like I belonged somewhere. That Saturday started like any other weekend. I woke up around 9, made coffee, and spent most of the day at my desk finishing a backlog of transcription files. For dinner, I made spaghetti and watched a couple episodes of a true crime show on Netflix. Ironic, considering what happened later. Around 11, I took my dog Pepper outside for her last bathroom break of the night. She was a 6-year-old shelter mutt, brown and white patches with one floppy ear that never quite stood upright. The air outside was thick and humid, typical for early June in Virginia, the kind of warmth that clings to your skin. I stood on the porch watching Pepper sniff around the yard, looking up at the stars scattered across the sky, in a way you never see in the city. Everything was quiet except for the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere in the woods. Pepper finished her business, trotted back inside, and I locked the front door behind us. Checked the back door out of habit. Went to bed around midnight feeling completely safe. I do not know how long I had been asleep when Pepper started growling. It was not her normal growl, the one she did when she saw a squirrel through the window or heard a car drive by on the main road. This was low and sustained, coming from deep in her chest, and she was standing at my bedroom door facing the hallway. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked the time, 1:47 a.m. For a few seconds, I just lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had set her off. Then I heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 steady knocks like someone was being polite about it. My first thought was that something had happened to Harold. Maybe he had fallen, maybe he had walked over in some kind of confused state. He was getting up there in age, and I worried about him. I got out of bed and walked quietly to the living room, Pepper staying right at my heels, still growling that low rumble. The front door had a small window at the top, but it was dark outside and I could not see much. I also had a window to the left of the door that looked out onto the porch, covered by thin curtains. I did not turn on any lights. Something told me not to, some instinct I cannot really explain, so I just stood there in the dark trying to see through the curtain. Then came another knock, and a voice, a man's voice, calm and friendly. He said his car had broken down about half a mile up the road, and his phone was dead. He asked if he could use my phone to call someone for help. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like the kind of thing that could happen to anyone on these back roads where cell service was spotty at best. But it was almost 2 in the morning, and I was a woman alone, and something about the situation made every muscle in my body tighten. I moved closer to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch to get a better look at who was standing on my porch. He looked normal. That was the thing that made it so hard to know what to do. He was maybe 40, wearing jeans and a plain dark t-shirt, average build, short brown hair. He had his hands in his pockets and he was standing a few feet back from the door, not pressed up against it like someone desperate or aggressive would be. He looked like a regular guy who had car trouble. I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting all those crime documentaries get to my head. But Pepper was still growling, her hackles raised all the way down her spine, and that dog had never been wrong about people. I had seen her wag her tail at complete strangers, and I had seen her bark at men who later turned out to be bad news. She had instincts I had learned to trust. So instead of opening the door, I spoke through it. I told him I could call someone for him, asked what number he needed. He said he appreciated that, gave me a name, said his brother lived about 20 miles away and could come pick him up. He even gave me a phone number. It all sounded so normal, so reasonable. I had my phone in my hand, ready to dial, when I glanced out the side window again. The porch light was off, and the only illumination came from a half moon. But my eyes had adjusted to the darkness by then. The man was still standing there, patient, waiting. And that is when I saw movement near the tree line at the edge of my property, maybe 50 yards from the house. At first I thought it was a deer, we had plenty of those around. But the shape was wrong. It was upright. It was a person, moving slowly along the edge of the woods, heading toward the back of my house. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked back at the man on the porch, and he was still standing there with that same calm expression, like he had all the time in the world. He had no idea I had seen the other one. Or maybe he knew exactly what was happening and this whole thing was part of a plan. I stepped back from the window, trying not to make any sudden movements, trying to think. My mind was racing through options. I could call 911, but the nearest sheriff's station was at least 25 minutes away, and I had no idea how much time I had. I could call Harold, but what was an 80-year-old man going to do? I thought about the back door, wondered if it was really locked, wondered if that second person was already testing it. The man on the porch knocked again, a little louder this time, and asked if everything was okay. His voice was still friendly, but there was something underneath it now, a hint of impatience. I told him through the door that I was calling his brother right now, that help would be on the way soon. I was stalling, buying myself time to figure out what to do. I moved quickly and quietly through the dark house to the kitchen, where I could see the backyard through the window above the sink. The second figure was closer now, maybe 30 yards from the house, and I could see it was a man, bigger than the one on the porch, wearing dark clothes and some kind of cap. He was not even trying to hide anymore. He was just walking toward my back door like he belonged there. I grabbed the biggest knife from the block on the counter. It was not much, but it was something. Then I went back to the front of the house and told the man on the porch that I was not going to open the door. I said I had called 911 and the police were on their way. It was a lie. I had not called yet, but I needed him to believe it. There was a long pause. I could not see his face from where I was standing, but I could feel the shift in the air, like the whole situation had changed in that moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The friendliness was gone. He said something like, "Come on, I just need to use your phone. Why are you making this difficult?" But it was not a question. It was a statement. And then I heard the back door handle rattle. Not a knock, not a polite request. Someone was trying to open it, testing to see if it was locked. Pepper went absolutely crazy, barking and snarling and throwing herself toward the back of the house. The man on the porch started pounding on the front door now. Not knocking anymore, pounding, and he was saying something, but I could not hear it over Pepper and the blood rushing in my ears. I finally called 911. My fingers were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone twice. The dispatcher answered, and I started talking fast, too fast, trying to explain that two men were trying to break into my house, that I was alone, that I needed help right now. She asked for my address and I gave it to her, and she told me to stay on the line, that she was sending units my way. But I knew how far away they were. I knew I was on my own for at least 20 minutes, probably more. The pounding on the front door stopped suddenly, and that silence was almost worse than the noise. I stood in the hallway between the front and back of the house, knife in one hand, phone in the other. Pepper pressed against my leg, still growling. I could hear footsteps on the porch, then nothing. Then I heard glass break somewhere at the back of the house. Not the door, one of the windows. The one in the small laundry room that I always meant to put a better lock on but never did. Pepper bolted toward the sound, barking so loud it hurt my ears, and I heard a man curse, and then more glass breaking as he tried to clear the frame. I ran to the laundry room doorway and saw a dark shape halfway through the window, one leg already inside. I did not think. I just reacted. I screamed at him, something I do not even remember, and I swung that knife at his arm. I felt it connect, felt resistance, and he yelled and pulled back out the window so fast he cut himself more on the broken glass. There was blood on my kitchen knife and blood on the window frame, and I was shaking so hard I thought I might collapse. The dispatcher was still on the line asking what was happening, and I was trying to tell her, but the words were not coming out right. I backed away from the window, expecting him to come through again or expecting the other one to try the front, but for a moment, everything went quiet. Pepper was still barking, but it was different now, more frantic, like she was trying to track movement she could hear, but I could not. I kept switching my attention between the front door and the broken window, waiting for someone to come through, knowing I could not defend both at the same time. Then I heard a car engine start. It was faint at first, somewhere down my gravel driveway, and then it got louder and I heard tires spinning on loose rock. I ran to the front window and saw taillights disappearing down the road, moving fast with no headlights on. They were leaving. I did not understand it at first. I was still braced for someone to come crashing through a door or window. But the sounds outside faded, and then there was nothing but crickets and Pepper whimpering beside me. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher for another 18 minutes until I saw the red and blue lights coming up my driveway. 2 deputies came to the door and I finally unlocked it, still holding that knife, still shaking. One of them was a woman named Hartley, who took the knife gently from my hand and led me to sit down while her partner cleared the house. They found blood on the laundry room window, on the ground outside, and a trail of it leading into the woods where they must have parked their car somewhere out of sight. The deputies told me I did the right thing, that I was lucky, that most people would have opened that door. The sheriff's department investigated for weeks, but never found them. No matching DNA in the system, no witnesses, no abandoned car with a flat tire anywhere near my road. It was like they had never existed. But here is the part that still keeps me up at night, even 2 years later. About 3 weeks after it happened, a deputy called to tell me they had connected my case to 2 other incidents in the county from the previous year. Same pattern. A man knocking on a door late at night with a story about car trouble. A second person waiting in the shadows. The other 2 houses, the people had opened their doors. One woman was beaten badly and robbed. The other, an older couple, the husband did not survive. They had been targeting isolated homes, places where help was far away, places where people still trusted strangers enough to open their doors at night. I never found out if they were caught. I moved back to Richmond 6 months later. I still have Pepper, and she still growls sometimes at night for no reason I can see. When she does, I do not go back to sleep. I just sit there in the dark, listening, waiting for a knock that I hope never comes. "14 years of warehouse work in New Jersey had left me burned out in ways I did not fully understand, until I quit. When my buddy Glenn mentioned a seasonal crop management gig in rural Virginia, I jumped at it without thinking twice. My engagement had collapsed the previous spring. I was renting a depressing studio apartment, and the idea of wide-open spaces sounded like medicine. The contract was simple. 6 months overseeing soybean fields for an agricultural company, with a rent-free farmhouse included as part of the deal. I loaded my Ford pickup and drove 5 hours south on a Wednesday morning in early September 2018. The property sat at the end of a gravel road called Hendricks Mill Lane, about 12 miles from the nearest town with a grocery store. The farmhouse itself was nothing special, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like old wood, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But the land stretched out flat and golden under the late summer sun, and for the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The first week passed without any trouble. I spent my days learning the irrigation system, checking soil moisture levels, and driving the perimeter of the 300 acres I was responsible for. The nearest neighbor, according to my contract paperwork, was a property about half a mile east, but the county records listed it as unoccupied, owned by some agricultural trust based out of Richmond. I could see the outline of a farmhouse and a large barn from my kitchen window, sitting dark against the tree line. No cars in the driveway, no movement, no signs of life whatsoever. The isolation took some getting used to, especially at night when the silence became so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in bed. But I kept busy, called my mom every few days, and started settling into a routine that felt almost peaceful. It was on the 8th night, a Tuesday, when I first noticed the lights. I was brushing my teeth around 11 when I glanced out the bathroom window and saw a faint yellow glow coming from the supposedly empty property to the east. A single light, maybe in an upstairs window, burning steady through the darkness. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the trust had sent someone to check on the property, or perhaps a caretaker stopped by occasionally. I finished brushing my teeth and went to bed, but I kept thinking about that light. The next morning, I drove the perimeter as usual and slowed down when I passed the eastern boundary. From the road, the neighboring farmhouse looked exactly as abandoned as before, peeling white paint, overgrown grass pushing up through cracks in the driveway, a rusted mailbox leaning at a 45-degree angle. No vehicles anywhere. I parked my truck and walked closer to the fence line, trying to see if there were any fresh tire tracks or footprints. Nothing. The place looked like it had been empty for years. I even checked my phone to confirm what I remembered from the county records, and there it was in black and white. Property owned by Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Trust. Status unoccupied. Last recorded activity dated back to 2014. I drove back to my farmhouse feeling stupid for even worrying about it. Old houses have electrical quirks, timers on lights, all kinds of explanations. But then it happened again that same night. This time I was sitting on the back porch around 10, drinking a beer and listening to the crickets, when I saw not 1 but 3 lights come on in sequence across the neighboring property. First the upstairs window, then something on the ground floor, then a light inside the barn. They stayed on for maybe 20 minutes, then went dark one by one in reverse order. I sat there with my beer getting warm in my hand, watching that dark silhouette against the tree line, waiting for something else to happen. It did not. The property just sat there, black and silent, like it had been abandoned all along. I went inside and locked every door, which felt ridiculous given that I had not locked anything since arriving. That night I slept poorly, waking up twice to sounds I could not identify. A low rumble that might have been a vehicle on a distant road, a rhythmic creaking that was probably just the house settling. In the morning, I found myself checking the windows before I even made coffee, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The following Saturday, I drove into town to pick up supplies and decided to ask around about the neighboring property. The town was called Burkeville, a small cluster of buildings centered around a gas station, a hardware store, and a diner called Maxine's that seemed to serve as the local gathering spot. I grabbed a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs from a woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned up in a bun. Her name tag said Darlene. When she brought my food, I mentioned I was working the Henderson contract out on Hendricks Mill Lane, and she nodded like she already knew. Small towns are like that. I asked her about the property to the east of mine, the one owned by some agricultural trust, and her expression changed in a way I cannot quite describe. Not fear exactly, more like caution. She said she did not know much about it, that properties changed hands a lot around here, and then she moved down the counter to refill someone else's coffee. I tried asking the guy sitting 2 stools over, a heavy-set man in a John Deere cap, who had been eating pancakes in silence. He looked at me for a long moment, syrup still dripping from his fork, and said something I will never forget. Best not to get involved in other people's boundaries out here. I pressed him on what that meant, but he just shook his head and went back to his pancakes. The whole diner had gone quiet, and I became aware that several people were watching me with expressions that ranged from pity to something harder, something like warning. I finished my eggs without tasting them and left a bigger tip than usual, hoping that might loosen someone up. It did not. Outside, I ran into an older man loading bags of fertilizer into a pickup truck, and I tried one more time. I told him I was new to the area, just trying to understand the lay of the land, and asked if he knew anything about the property east of my place. He stopped loading and looked at me with pale blue eyes that had probably seen 70 winters or more. He said the land out there had history, that people who owned it tended to keep to themselves, and that I should do the same. When I asked what kind of history, he just climbed into his truck and drove away without another word. I stood there in the parking lot feeling like I had walked into the middle of a conversation that had been going on for decades, speaking a language everyone understood but me. That night, everything changed. I was lying in bed around 1 a.m, not quite asleep but drifting in that halfway state, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate, crunching along at maybe 5 miles per hour. I got up and moved to the window without turning on any lights, keeping myself pressed against the wall so I could see out without being seen. A vehicle was rolling past my property on Hendricks Mill Lane. A large pickup truck or maybe an SUV, I could not tell for certain because it had no headlights on. Just a dark shape moving through the darker night, engine barely above idle. It passed my driveway and continued down the road toward the eastern property, then disappeared around a bend. I stood at that window for maybe 15 minutes waiting until I saw it come back the other way. Same speed, same silence, same absence of lights. This time it slowed even more as it passed my house, and I swear I could feel eyes scanning my windows, even though I could not see anyone inside the vehicle. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After it passed, I did not go back to bed. I sat in the kitchen with every light off, watching the road through the window above the sink until the sun came up. The morning brought something worse. I walked the perimeter of my farmhouse the way I had started doing every day, checking for anything out of place, and that is when I found the footprints. They were in the soft dirt beneath my bedroom window, 2 distinct boot prints, deep enough to suggest someone had been standing there for a while. The window itself was about 5 feet off the ground, too high to see in without effort, but if someone stood on their toes or brought something to stand on, they would have had a clear view of my bed. I crouched down and studied those prints, trying to memorize every detail. Work boots size 11 or 12 with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. There were more prints leading away from the window, tracking through the grass toward the back of the property. I followed them for about 200 yards until they reached an old irrigation ditch that cut through the fields toward the eastern boundary. The ditch was dry and overgrown with weeds, clearly unused for years, but the vegetation had been trampled flat in a narrow path. Someone had been using this ditch as a corridor to access my property without being seen from the road. I called the sheriff's department that afternoon. A deputy named Womack came out around 4, a tall man with a sunburned neck and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had seen everything twice. I showed him the footprints, which had dried and hardened in the midday heat, and walked him out to the irrigation ditch. He listened to everything I said without interrupting, nodding occasionally, writing nothing down. When I finished, he stood there looking out toward the eastern property for a long moment before speaking. He said that folks out here valued their privacy, that property lines could be complicated when you had old irrigation rights and shared access roads from decades past. I told him someone had been watching me through my bedroom window, and he said he understood my concern, but that there was not much he could do without more evidence. No crime had technically been committed. Before he left, he gave me his card and told me to call if anything else happened, but the way he said it made me feel like he was just going through the motions. I watched his cruiser disappear down Hendricks Mill Lane, and realized I was completely on my own out here. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of the bedroom window and slept with a kitchen knife on the nightstand. The next 3 days were quiet, and I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. Maybe the footprints were from a surveyor or someone checking utility lines. Maybe the vehicle without headlights was just a local taking a shortcut who did not want to disturb anyone. I threw myself into work, spending long hours in the fields, trying to focus on soil samples and irrigation schedules instead of what might be lurking in the darkness. But on the fourth night, a Wednesday, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps on my porch. Not imagined, not dreamed, real footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaking across the old wooden boards. I lay perfectly still in bed, barely breathing, listening as they moved from one end of the porch to the other. Then they stopped right outside my front door. I heard the doorknob turn, just slightly, testing to see if it was locked. It was. The footsteps resumed, circling around the side of the house, pausing at each window. I tracked the sound as it moved, living room, kitchen, bathroom, until it reached the back door. Another doorknob test, another locked barrier. Then nothing. Silence so complete it roared in my ears. I did not move until sunlight started bleeding through the curtains, and when I finally got up to check, I found fresh boot prints circling the entire house. Same size, same wear pattern on the left heel. I decided I was done waiting for something worse to happen. That morning, I drove to the hardware store in Burkeville and bought a trail camera, the kind hunters use to monitor deer paths. I mounted it on a tree facing the irrigation ditch, angled to capture anyone coming onto my property from that direction. Then I bought a second one and placed it on the corner of my porch, aimed at the front door and the gravel driveway. The clerk who sold them to me, a young guy named Sutton with a patchy beard and nervous hands, asked if I was having trouble with wildlife. I told him something like that. He looked at me for a beat too long before ringing me up, and I got the sense he knew exactly what kind of trouble I was having. That night, I sat in my truck at the edge of the property with the engine off and the windows down, watching the eastern tree line through binoculars I had ordered online 2 days before. Around midnight, I saw them. 2 figures emerging from the barn on the neighboring property, moving across the field in my direction. They walked in single file, staying low, using the terrain to mask their approach. I watched them enter the irrigation ditch about 300 yards out, and then I lost sight of them in the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I wanted to start the truck and flood them with headlights, but something told me that would only make things worse. Instead, I waited until I heard the soft crunch of footsteps near my house. Then I laid on the horn for a solid 30 seconds. The sound shattered the night like a bomb. When I finally stopped, I heard running, fast, panicked, retreating toward the ditch. The trail cameras caught everything. 2 men, faces partially obscured by baseball caps pulled low, crossing onto my property around 12:15 in the morning. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see they were carrying something, a duffel bag, maybe tools. I could not tell for certain. I saved the files to my phone and drove straight to the state police barracks 40 miles north, bypassing the local sheriff entirely. The trooper who reviewed the footage, a woman named Kendrick with close-cropped gray hair and no patience for small talk, made some calls while I waited in the lobby. An hour later, she told me what the locals had refused to say. The property to the east had been flagged in a federal investigation. Something about illegal cultivation hidden in the back acreage, distribution networks running through rural properties with absentee owners. The agricultural trust was a front, and the people operating out of there had been watching me since the day I arrived, trying to figure out if I was law enforcement or just an unlucky contractor who had wandered into the wrong place. Trooper Kendrick arranged for me to break my lease that same day. No penalties, no questions. I packed everything I owned in under 2 hours and drove north without looking back. I found out later that a raid happened about 3 weeks after I left. Multiple arrests, the whole operation dismantled. Sometimes I still think about those nights alone in that farmhouse, the footsteps circling in the darkness, the eyes watching from the tree line. The countryside had seemed so peaceful when I arrived, so empty and quiet. But the silence was never emptiness. It was just everyone around me holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. At the time, my life felt small and quiet in a way I actually needed. I'd rented a lonely countryside house tucked between fields and looping back roads that only tractors and grain trucks seemed to know by heart. I worked remotely, kept odd hours, and barely saw another person once the sun went down. The house itself was old but solid, with thick doors, narrow windows, and a long gravel driveway that disappeared into darkness at night. Most evenings were spent with a lamp on, the wind moving the trees and the distant hum of insects. I liked how cut off it felt, like the world had decided to leave me alone for a while. That sense of isolation was the whole reason I chose the place. It never occurred to me that someone else might notice how alone I was. The first thing that caught my attention happened late at night, when I was rinsing a mug at the sink and the room briefly brightened. Headlights slid across the far wall, slow and deliberate, not like a car passing through. I stepped closer to the window and watched the beams creep along the edge of the property, then disappear just beyond the trees. It didn't bother me much at first. Farm vehicles move strangely, and the roads around there twisted in ways that didn't make sense unless you drove them daily. Still, it kept happening, always after midnight, always slow. Sometimes the lights would pause, idling somewhere I couldn't see, engine low and patient. When they finally moved on, the darkness felt heavier than before. A couple weeks later, new sounds joined the routine. Early mornings, just before the sky started to lighten, faint clicks and soft pressure came from the front door. It wasn't violent or rushed, more like someone checking a locked car in a parking lot. One morning it was the back door, another time a window frame near the laundry room. Whoever it was never stayed long, and nothing was damaged. I walked the house afterward, heart thumping, finding everything exactly as I'd left it. That somehow made it worse. Locks untouched meant the person testing them knew they could wait. The storm arrived without much warning, rolling in heavy and loud, flattening the fields with rain, and bending the trees until they groaned. The power cut out first, then the cell signal dropped to nothing, leaving the house humming with rain and silence. Candles barely pushed back the dark, and the wind kept hitting the walls like it was trying to listen through them. That was when the headlights came back, brighter this time, stopping so close the glow leaked under the curtains. I stood there realizing something with a clarity that made my chest ache. Whoever was outside hadn't been trying to get in before. They'd been learning the house, learning me, and waiting for the moment when no one could hear me call for help. I stayed still, listening, counting the seconds between gusts of wind and the soft idle of an engine somewhere beyond the trees. The rain masked smaller sounds, but not all of them. Gravel shifted, slow footsteps pressing into wet ground, careful enough not to splash. A shadow moved past one of the side windows, tall and narrow, pausing where the glass met the frame. There was no rush in the movement, no panic. It felt practiced, like someone following steps they'd rehearsed in their head many times. I backed away from the window, keeping to the darker part of the room, trying to control my breathing as the house creaked around me. The first real contact came at the back door. Not a knock, not a bang, just the gentle turn of the handle testing the resistance. Metal whispered against metal. It stopped, then tried again, slower, as if whoever was outside wanted to feel exactly how much pressure it took. I moved through the hallway on bare feet, each board threatening to betray me with noise. The flashlight in my hand shook enough that the beam bounced along the walls. When I reached the kitchen, the handle stopped moving, replaced by a long, thoughtful silence. I imagined someone standing there in the rain, hand resting on the door, deciding what came next. Minutes stretched until time lost its shape. The storm howled, thunder rolling so close it rattled the cabinets. Then the testing began again, this time at a window near the living room. Fingers brushed the glass, slow and deliberate, tracing the edge like they were memorizing it. I crouched behind the couch, phone useless in my hand, and realized how completely cut off I was. No lights from neighbors, no passing cars, nothing but fields and dark. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about breaking in fast. It was about waiting me out, seeing how long fear could do the work instead. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The headlights stayed for a while longer, washing the side of the house in white, then finally pulled away. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed what I could carry and left the house unlocked behind me, gravel crunching too loud under my tires as I drove away. Later, a local deputy walked the property and found nothing but deep footprints pressed into the mud near every door and window. No sign of forced entry. I never went back. Whatever patience had been waiting for me out there didn't need another chance. As days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The whole thing, those headlights, the quiet testing, sat with me like a shadow, one I couldn't outrun. It's easy to tell yourself things like maybe it was just a strange coincidence or there's a perfectly logical explanation, but deep down I knew better. I still couldn't explain how someone could have learned that house so thoroughly without ever stepping foot inside, or why they'd only been testing, never forcing. There was no conclusion to the nightmare that made sense. No one came forward. No evidence was found. The sheriff's department gave me the usual keep an eye out talk and moved on. But I couldn't. A few months later, I did some digging trying to find answers, or at least make peace with the strange events. Turns out, a similar pattern had been reported in a nearby town years before. Another woman, renting another old farmhouse, had noticed headlights passing by her home, followed by strange behavior around her doors. She'd left too, but by the time she did, the sheriff had already dropped her case. She was never even given the chance to speak in person, her complaint buried in bureaucracy. Like mine, her story faded into nothingness. I still think about that night. The silence after the headlights disappeared was one of the loudest things I've ever heard. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. I've learned a few things in the time since. How fragile a sense of safety can be. How quickly it can be snatched away. But there's one thing that still haunts me more than anything. Whoever it was wasn't interested in me getting away. They were waiting for the moment when I couldn't leave. And that, more than anything, is what still keeps me up at night. Posting this here feels strange, but the memory still sits heavy with me, and maybe someone out there will recognize pieces of it. At the time, my life was simple and a little worn around the edges, the kind of phase where quiet feels like a solution to everything. I had just bought a neglected rural farm through a county auction, drawn in by the low price and the promise of isolation. The listing described it as vacant for years, a forgotten patch of land with a farmhouse and an old barn leaning into the wind. I imagined slow mornings, manual work, and the kind of silence you can't buy in town. Friends thought it was impulsive, but impulsive felt better than stagnant. The drive out there was long and empty, gravel roads stretching farther than expected. By the time I unlocked the farmhouse door, the sun was already low, turning the fields dull and flat. The first hours were spent opening windows and pushing stale air out of the rooms. Dust coated every surface, but not in the uniform way abandoned places usually collect it. Inside a bedroom closet, shirts still hung on mismatched hangers, sleeves stiff but not decayed. In the kitchen, canned food lined a shelf, labels faded but intact, some arranged with a care that didn't match abandonment. A notebook sat on the table, pages filled with cramped handwriting, dates from only a few months earlier. That detail caught my attention more than anything else, because the auction paperwork claimed no one had lived there in years. I walked room to room, noticing small things that felt paused rather than left behind. A chair angled toward a window, a pair of work boots by the door, a half-used bar of soap. None of it fit the story I had been sold. As evening settled in, the property took on a different tone. Sounds carried farther than expected, each creak of wood snapping sharp in the open air. While unloading tools from my truck, a dull thud echoed from the barn, deep and hollow. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal scramble either. It sounded deliberate, like weight shifting. I stood still, listening, counting my breaths without meaning to. The barn doors were shut, chained the way I'd left them earlier. When I walked closer, the smell of hay and damp earth grew stronger, and the noise stopped completely. That silence felt heavier than the sound had been. Later that night, curiosity won out over caution. With a flashlight in hand, I crossed the yard again, beam cutting through tall grass and catching movement that turned out to be nothing at all. Near the barn, fresh footprints pressed into the dirt, clear and sharp, leading away from the doors toward the farmhouse. They weren't mine, and they weren't old. The prints followed a path I had walked earlier, then veered off, circling back toward the house. Standing there, I felt exposed in a way that's hard to explain, like the land itself was watching. I locked every door when I went back inside, double-checking each one, even though I knew it wouldn't change much. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sense that the house wasn't as empty as it claimed to be. Morning light didn't bring the relief I expected. The house looked ordinary again, almost harmless, but the details from the night before refused to fade. Over coffee made with bottled water, I went through the notebook I'd found, reading the entries slowly. The writing jumped between mundane notes about chores and sharper comments about noises, doors left open, and shadows near the tree line. One page mentioned someone entering the barn repeatedly, always after dark, always leaving no trace by morning. That conflicted with the official records I'd reviewed before buying the place, so I drove into the nearest town to ask questions. The county office was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of old paper. When I mentioned the farm, the clerk paused longer than necessary before answering. According to public records, the previous owners had left abruptly, citing safety concerns that never made it into formal complaints. No police reports, no inspections, no follow-up visits. It was treated like a quiet relocation, the kind rural families make without explanation. An older man waiting behind me leaned in and said he remembered lights moving across that land late at night, long after it was supposed to be empty. He shrugged it off as trespassers or kids looking for trouble, but his voice lacked conviction. Driving back, I noticed tire tracks near the fence line that hadn't been there the day before. They stopped short of the road as if someone preferred not to be seen coming or going. By the time I reached the house, the sense of being observed had returned. That afternoon, I focused on clearing brush around the barn, trying to ground myself in physical work. Inside, the air felt warmer than it should have, carrying a faint smell of sweat and old fabric. In a corner stall, I found a blanket folded neatly, still holding the shape of recent use. There were food wrappers tucked behind a beam, the kind you'd eat in a hurry, trying not to make noise. None of it belonged to me, and none of it looked old enough to match an abandoned property. As the sun dipped again, the same sounds returned, footsteps shifting above the hayloft. I called out, my voice echoing uselessly against wood and metal, and the movement stopped immediately. Night fell faster than I wanted it to. From the farmhouse window, I saw a light flicker in the barn, faint but unmistakable. This time I didn't approach blindly. I grabbed my truck keys and headlight swept the yard as I drove closer, flooding the space with harsh white beams. The barn stood open, doors wide, chain cut clean through. No one was inside, but the footprints were there again, leading straight back toward the house. I didn't stay to search further. I left the property before midnight, drove until my hands steadied on the wheel, and didn't return until days later with help. The farm was sold again soon after, quietly, and I never learned who had been living there, or why they stopped the moment I showed up. Returning to the property days later felt different, like crossing into a place that no longer wanted me there. I brought a friend with me, someone practical who didn't scare easily, and we walked the land in daylight. The farmhouse looked unchanged, but the barn told another story. Inside, the blanket was gone, the wrappers vanished, and the loft was swept clean as if someone had taken care to erase themselves. Even the footprints had been smoothed out, dirt dragged flat with something heavy. My friend tried to laugh it off, suggested squatters who got nervous once the place sold. The explanation sounded thin even as he said it. Nothing about the cleanup felt rushed or careless. We spent hours checking every structure, every shed, every line of fence. Near the far edge of the property, hidden behind tall weeds, we found a narrow footpath leading into the woods. It wasn't marked on any map, worn down just enough to suggest repeated use. Along the trail were small signs of life: a crushed soda can, a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch, boot marks half filled with dirt. Whoever used it knew how to move without leaving much behind. Standing there, I realized how easy it would be to watch the house from that spot, to wait until lights went out. The isolation I had wanted suddenly felt like exposure instead. That night I stayed in a motel in town instead of the farmhouse. Sleep came easier there, but my thoughts kept circling back to the notebook and those recent dates. The idea that someone had been living alongside the myth of abandonment unsettled me more than any noise. It wasn't a ghost story or some dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that. Someone had been there, close enough to hear footsteps, close enough to know routines, and careful enough to vanish when attention arrived. The county never followed up, and no one seemed interested in reopening the past. Silence, I learned, can be a form of protection in small places. In the end, I made a practical choice. I listed the farm and sold it without ever spending another night there. I never mentioned the belongings or the footprints, just said the land wasn't the right fit. Sometimes I still think about whoever lived in those shadows and why they stopped when I appeared. Maybe they moved on to another forgotten place, or maybe they learned to stay hidden better. I don't know, and that's the part that lingers. The farm taught me that isolation doesn't always mean empty, and that some spaces remember people long after the records forget them. Moving into that house marked the start of a quieter chapter of my life, or at least that's what I believed at the time. I had just inherited a small place tucked far from any city, surrounded by fields that rolled on longer than my patience for traffic ever had. My days back then were simple: remote work in the mornings, unpacking boxes in the afternoons, and long walks at dusk to clear my head. The town itself looked like something preserved on purpose. One main road, a few aging storefronts, and houses spaced just far enough apart to feel private. I told people online I was craving isolation, but the truth was I needed distance from everything that had piled up behind me. The house wasn't special: creaky floors, outdated cabinets, a porch that leaned slightly to the left. Still, it felt like a reset button I desperately wanted to press. The locals made a point of introducing themselves within my first few days. Always polite, always brief. Names slipped out of my head quickly, but faces didn't, especially the way some of them lingered longer than necessary when we spoke. Conversations followed the same pattern: questions about how long I planned to stay, whether I worked from home, and what time I usually turned in at night. At first, I chalked it up to small-town curiosity, the kind people warn you about but never really explain. Every wave from across the road felt practiced, synchronized even. One woman, Rachel, who lived 2 houses down, casually mentioned she noticed my porch light stayed on late. She said it with a laugh, but it landed heavier than she probably intended. It didn't take long before people started commenting on my movements before I ever brought them up. Someone at the general store asked if my morning walks helped with sleep, even though I hadn't mentioned them to anyone. Another neighbor suggested I avoid certain back roads once the sun dipped too low, offering no reason beyond a shrug and a vague warning tone. The strangest part wasn't the advice itself, but how consistent it was, as if everyone had rehearsed the same lines. Each evening, I caught glimpses of figures lingering near fences or parked trucks that hadn't been there moments before. Curtains across the street shifted whenever my front door opened. I started varying my routine without telling anyone, just to see if the comments would stop. They didn't. The first real crack in my sense of safety came quietly, almost easy to miss. A kitchen drawer I knew I had closed sat open when I returned from a short drive. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, and the locks were exactly as I'd left them. Over the next few days, it kept happening. Small things out of place, a chair angled differently, a window unlatched but not forced. When I mentioned it at the local station, the officer listened with a thin patience that felt rehearsed. He suggested stress, settling in nerves, and reminded me that people here respected privacy. Walking back home, I noticed the same parked truck at the edge of my driveway that had been there earlier. Engine cold, tires dusty. That was the moment I understood I wasn't just being watched. I was being monitored. Sleep became fragmented after that, not because of noise, but because of the silence pressing in on me. At night, the house made sounds I couldn't quite place, soft shifts that didn't belong to old wood settling. I started leaving objects exactly where I could remember them, down to the angle of a mug handle or the position of a rug corner. More than once, I woke to find those details altered by morning. The air inside the house sometimes carried a faint scent that wasn't mine, like unfamiliar soap or cold fabric pulled from storage. When I asked Rachel if she ever had issues with people wandering onto her property, she paused longer than usual before answering. She told me everyone looks out for each other here, and that I should be grateful for the attention. The sense of being managed rather than protected grew stronger as days passed. People would appear when I returned home, as if alerted the moment my tires hit the gravel. One man I'd never spoken to greeted me by name while leaning against my mailbox, commenting on how late I was compared to usual. I asked how he knew, and he smiled like I'd asked something naive. He said routines matter in places like this, that predictability keeps things peaceful. That word stuck with me, peaceful, because nothing about the way he said it felt calm. It sounded more like a rule than a reassurance. I tried pushing back in small ways, staying out longer, taking different routes, leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using. The reactions came quickly. A note appeared on my porch one evening, written in careful block letters, warning me about roads I didn't need to test. Another time, someone knocked just after dark to tell me my back window had been open earlier, even though I'd been home all day. When I mentioned the notes and visits to the authorities again, the response was polite but firm. They said newcomers often misread community concern, and that stirring things up wouldn't help me settle in. The message was clear without being spoken outright. Isolation crept in next, heavy and deliberate. Phone calls dropped unexpectedly, internet outages became frequent, and my requests for repairs were delayed without explanation. I stopped receiving mail altogether for a stretch, even though I saw the delivery truck pass by. The house felt smaller with each passing night, like the walls were inching closer in agreement with the town. I realized then that leaving wasn't just discouraged, it was expected if I couldn't adapt. Outsiders didn't challenge the rhythm here. They either learned it or disappeared from it, and for the first time since arriving I understood that the house wasn't the thing I'd inherited. It was the test. The turning point came late in the afternoon, when I returned from a supply run and found the front door unlocked. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the handle, replaying every movement of my hands before I'd left. Inside, nothing looked disturbed at first glance, but the house carried that same unfamiliar scent again, stronger this time. On the kitchen table sat a folded piece of paper I knew hadn't been there before. It wasn't threatening, not directly. It simply listed times, my usual departure, my return when lights went out. At the bottom, one sentence was written smaller than the rest, reminding me that life runs smoother when everyone agrees on the order of things. I didn't bother calling the authorities again. Instead, I packed a bag with only what I could carry: clothes, documents, my laptop, and a few personal items that still felt like mine. As dusk settled in, cars passed my house slower than usual, headlights lingering on the windows. Someone knocked once, firm but unhurried, then walked away when I didn't answer. I stayed still on the living room floor, breathing shallow, listening to footsteps circle the house without ever rushing. It wasn't fear that pinned me there. It was clarity. This place wasn't dangerous in the way people expect. It was organized, and I wasn't part of the system. When night fully set in, I slipped out through the back, walking across the fields instead of using the driveway. The land dipped and rose in uneven waves, my shoes soaking through with dew. Behind me, I could hear distant engines starting, doors closing, but no one shouted or chased. They didn't need to. By the time I reached the main road, my legs burned and my phone had no signal, but the silence finally felt empty instead of watched. I flagged down a passing truck hours later and didn't explain much, only that I needed a ride far away. The driver didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. I never went back for the rest of my things. Weeks later, I received a single forwarded envelope at a temporary address, containing the house keys and a short note thanking me for understanding how things work there. No return address, no signature. I sold the property without setting foot on it again, accepted a price far lower than it was worth, and considered it a fair trade. Sometimes I still catch myself tracking routines out of habit, checking windows twice, listening too closely. I don't talk about that town out loud, but I know this much for sure. Some places don't want you harmed, they just want you compliant.